The following video is a review for the 2024 game Silent Hill 2. If you haven't played this game before or the original, then be aware that this video will contain spoilers for both, as I'll be comparing certain aspects of the two games through. Silent Hill 2 is a game I have a lot of fond memories of when I played it back in 2001 on the PlayStation 2. I was only a child when I played it, and thanks to my older brother sharing the same bedroom as myself, it gave me access to a lot of games that I maybe shouldn't have been playing at my age. I didn't care though, as I was simply fascinated by games in general and was happy to read gaming magazines or watch TV shows about them. I was almost obsessed. Consuming media at the young age it wasn't difficult to scare me, whether I was watching films like Alien, The Terminator, or playing games themselves like Resident Evil or Dino Crisis. Even something like the Ghost House stages in Super Mario World unsettled me due to the music and graphics used. There was an edge to the art used in games from that era that I feel has slowly been removed as time has gone on. When I say edge, we kind of know what I mean. Compare the previous example, Super Mario World and its ghost stages, to how those same stages are depicted today in the newer Mario games, or something like Twisted Metal 2 versus the 2012 game on the PS3. There was a dark undertone to many games in the 90s, and I believe Silent Hill 2 was the peak of this artistic, edgy tone, but was also the end of it. So what was it about Silent Hill 2 that was scary to me as a child? I would say it was less about the monsters and more about the subtle psychological aspects of the game. I'm not saying as a child I understood the 5 stages of grief or anything like that, but I did know that a town should not be extremely foggy and abandoned while still being relatively undamaged. The atmospheric tone of the game, the fear of the unknown, and what lurks around every corner is what the game did extremely well, and over 24 years later, I would say Silent Hill 2 still holds up in this regard. But first, a quick bit of history on what the state of the franchise was leading up to this remake. The original game released in 2001 on the PS2 and was received very well, becoming a classic for the system and survival horror games in general. The franchise would later get a number of installments as time went on, but the quality of those games lessened with each entry, as did the sales. The first 3 games were well received, but Silent Hill 4 is arguably when the franchise started its actual decline. The next generation of consoles weren't kind to the franchise either, with many disappointing games releasing, but the biggest nail in the coffin must have been the HD collection released in 2012 on the PS3 and Xbox 360, due to not only questionable artistic changes, but missing or reduced graphics that are vital to the art, along with the original voice actors being replaced. The franchise at this point was unironically on its deathbed, and it was clear at this point in 2012 that Konami was unsure of what to do with it, having failed to give the fans a well-received entry since the third game in 2003. But in 2014, a demo released for the PlayStation 4 called PT, and it was revealed at the end of the demo to be a new Silent Hill game in development by the Metal Gear Solid director Hideo Kojima. The demo was well received, and it seemed for the moment the franchise will be making a proper comeback. The following year, however, Kojima would leave Konami, and Konami would later announce that they were ceasing development of games on consoles to instead focus on mobile gaming. At this point, any hope of a new Silent Hill game was dead, and so the franchise would lay dormant for over a decade. In 2021, Polish game developer Blooper Team and Konami announced a partnership, and rumours of a Silent Hill 2 remake followed not long after, as Blooper Team was known for creating horror games already, some of which actually took inspiration from Silent Hill in the first place. Other people, however, apparently didn't like the way their games were written and how they mishandled certain themes like mental health, aspects that are very important to the Silent Hill franchise, and so the rumours were basically a disappointment to many people, including myself, based on many impressions I've read from people who have played their games. In late 2022, Silent Hill 2 Remake was actually officially announced, and Blooper Team was the developer behind it. I was completely deflated at the announcement. I didn't really enjoy the trailer either, and while the developer had experience with horror games in the past, Silent Hill 2 isn't simply another horror game. It has sensitive themes to its story that need to be handled carefully, as well as nailing down the right atmosphere and tone. In other words, remaking Silent Hill 2 for me meant, at minimum, even with a world-class developer who knew how to write good stories and had experience making horror atmosphere, the chances of this remake being faithful enough to the original was very low. There's simply too many examples of remakes failing to understand the original art and narrative intent of the source material. So this remake for me was doomed before it was even announced. Eventually, I did end up buying a copy of the game after positive word of mouth from fans and from critics. And what I found genuinely surprised me. Silent Hill 2 starts off with the protagonist James Sunderland arriving in the town searching for his wife, having received a letter stating she was waiting for him in their special place. However, his wife has been dead for 3 years because of a disease, so already things aren't looking normal from the get-go. The iconic intro scene shows him in the public bathroom looking at his hands and face in the mirror. He seems to be shaken up by something and is trying to keep composed. The letter being read by Mary is another iconic part of Silent Hill 2, and I like how the new voice acting sounds. Mary sounds like she's battling the illness as she reads the letter. She sounds more tired and it feels like there's more raw emotion being portrayed through the reading.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
The original was no slouch for 2001 either, and it feels like the letter isn't simply being read off a script but having to also account for the serious tone of the game as a whole. And in that regard, it's done a good job and it still sounds good even today.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
If I had to pick which I prefer, remake or original, then I'd say there's no winner. They're both good in their own way. But if I was forced to pick, I'd say I prefer the new voice acting because it portrays the illness Mary has better and it has more emotion. But I'd say the original has better atmosphere and music. As you're travelling through the forest, you can hear screams and other strange sounds that give you a hint of what's to come. The game has really fantastic ambient sounds throughout, and most of it is done to unsettle the player, which might seem obvious, but many games either have too much background noise for tension or too little so they can invoke isolation. Silent Hill 2 plays background ambience at the appropriate times when it's needed. In the graveyard we meet a woman named Angela who's looking for her mother. The interaction they have is strange. She doesn't seem to know where she really is, and the way the conversation flows, it seems like she's unsure of something. I assume she also just arrived in Silent Hill recently, like James, so she warns him that there is something wrong with the town. For the remake, I was worried that the voice acting and dialogue would be changed to be more cinematic or hammy, but thankfully things are kept mostly the same as in the original. The tone of the voice acting is more mature and professional, I'd say, but this isn't to put down the original voice acting at all, and I'd say for its time it was pretty good compared to contemporary games. But nowadays, the voice acting has become its own industry, and as such, standards have risen greatly, as well as techniques and the equipment being used. That being said, there are times when I actually prefer the original voice acting over the remakes, which we'll get to. A fun little out of bounds Easter egg can be found in the ranch on the way to the town. If you use a camera mod on the PC version to move the camera around freely, you can see the infamous HD Collections ranch sign, which caused an actual controversy back in the day because it used the generic Comic Sans font. The developers of Remake, I'm happy to report, have finally restored the sign to its former glory. But you eventually arrive in the town proper, and it's clear that something's wrong. Everything's deserted, roadworks block parts of the town along with some sinkholes with seemingly endless depths. You follow a trail of blood which leads you to a house where you're introduced to the first enemy of the game, the lion figure. The lead up to this encounter is done well thanks to James having to crawl under a bloody garage door, and while knowing something bad was obviously going to happen, there was still an air of intensity kept through. The lion figure enemy itself looks like it's wrapped within a blanket or a bag with stitches, and it wriggles around as though it's in pain. It also wears high-heeled shoes, so it seems to represent both Mary in her sickbed as well as James's sexual frustrations because he isn't able to be intimate with his wife. They also do a puke attack, which could be a reference to Mary getting sick as the illness grew worse. The enemies throughout the game all have symbolism attached to them, and I'll be explaining how and why as we meet them. But first, before we go deeper into the story, I think it's best now to explain what's actually happening with the town itself before things become too vague or confusing. The town is cursed because of what happened to a little girl in the first game, who was tortured and then sacrificed in order to resurrect a god. The ritual goes wrong, however, and so Silent Hill now has different planes of existence and is attracting particular people to it who have some kind of inner struggle. The town's default state is called the fog world, which we're currently in, and is a supernatural plane of existence, and the monsters you see around it are basically manifestations of that person's subconscious. So an example would be the monster James sees throughout the game are visually sexualized in some way because of his own frustrations with his wife, who was obviously too ill to be intimate. What this means is the monsters one character would see would appear different to another. James might see a lion figure while Angela or another character would see something completely different, even though they were in the same spot. Later on we'll see different planes of existences that is more disturbing than the fog world. What this all likely means is that the town itself is in the normal world is likely still trucking along with people in it going about their daily business, unaware that the town itself holds an extremely dark secret. That's the basic gist of it. You don't need to play the first game to understand the second game's story. It's self-contained, and so anyone can just play it. Some little details here and there will be missing, but they're not integral to this game's plot. After the encounter with the lion figure, you'll find a radio and it sounds like someone's calling out to James on the other end, and we head back into the town to investigate it more. And I really like how the maps in general are laid out. It feels natural, but also mechanically simple to figure out where you are and where you need to be going. James will also add details to the map too, like if a door is locked or sometimes if there's hints for puzzles. It's a more streamlined experience, sure, compared to the original. The details on the map felt more like conveniences than dumbing down though in the remake. We make our way back into the town's main street, and this is where the game opens up. You can explore shops, alleyways, smash car shop windows to get ammo and health, as well as find notes and newspaper clippings to read. Some of these collectibles explore the town's history, and some of the notes in the game are linked together to form a story of their own, which usually ends with a solution to a puzzle or a way to proceed with the story. I think it's a good way to progress a linear story heavy game like this. I feel like too many games simply point the player exactly where they need to go, or to tick off some mundane checklist, which feels like a waste of time. Whereas in Silent Hill 2, at least you're getting some story in there too when you have to find solutions to a blocked path. Repairing the record player and finding the kind to play in the jukebox, it gives James a flashback to when he and Mary were in the Silent Hill Park by the lake. The record eventually breaks, and I feel this happens because it's also alluding to James's life at this point, having lost his wife and is now in a town full of monsters and alone. His life is somewhat broken at this point. Some parts of the game have outbursts of violent weather along with increased enemy count, and these moments are rare, but when they do happen it's a great contrast to the usually calmer atmosphere, which in turn creates a feeling of panic. But we reach the Woodside Apartments, which is the first main area of the game. You'll progress through these main areas to solve puzzles, meet characters, and then eventually fight a boss, where afterwards you go outside to find the next location and then rinse and repeat. For the most part, that's how the game's progression is set up. The apartment itself is not exactly what I think of when it comes to a horror setting, but it makes sense in a way. It was at one point a place inhabited by people and full of life and energy, but has now been twisted into an empty husk full of monsters. It's not your usual haunted mansion, which is a nice change of setting, I suppose. But as you'll explore the apartment, you'll come across a dark room illuminated by a flashlight on clothing similar to the one worn by Mary. Like the original, this is your introduction to a new enemy, the mannequin. And the way both remake and the original introduced the character is brilliant. It's completely hidden in plain sight until you grab the flashlight. It's a great jump scare moment. The symbolism is also interesting. The mannequin's feminine legs likely represent James's sexual desire, just like the first enemy, but they also lack a face. So it's possibly related to James not wanting to remember Mary as she goes through her illness, as it's shown in some endings her face has actually become disfigured from it as well. A new animation was added to the remake where they'll do a seductive walk towards you, and while it does further sexualise the enemy, it does so in a way that isn't too over the top and actually does make sense. But somewhere in the middle of exploring the apartment, we get our first look at probably the franchise's most iconic character, the Pyramid Head. I think the lead up to seeing it is good. You're exploring around the apartment and then you hear the usual radio static in the hallway, but this time it feels stronger and more aggressive. Around the corner you see a red glow in the distance where Pyramid Head is standing. You can't see it until you get close enough, but when you do it's unnerving because it's so unannounced. The entire moment is also optional and some players may have even missed it. I wish more games would actually do this and not have to rely on cutscenes to reveal main antagonists. Sometimes the character just speaks for itself, and I'm a fan of player discovery in general, so it's great that Remake didn't change this aspect of the original. It must have been tempting for the developers to do so. Shortly after finding a gun, you enter a room where a dead body is facing a TV that's turned on. It seems to have a headshot wound as its head is covered. It's here that the atmosphere of the apartment starts to change a little. The ambient sound in this room is unsettling thanks to the industrial sounds and the horn that echoes. The ambient music throughout is usually unique to each location, and it helps to give them a specific feeling of atmosphere. The body itself is infamous in the original for looking exactly like James and possibly even reuses the same model. It seems to be the case in Remake as well, although it's covered up better. The other corpses found throughout the game also look similar to James, and in Remake, with the exception of the apartment body, they seem to have made them more obvious. I'll be speaking about this later on in its own dedicated section. You'll eventually come across a room that has a dead body in a kitchen and hear someone in the bathroom. It's a new character, Eddie, who's vomiting and quick to deny that he had anything to do with the dead body in the kitchen. Compared to the original, the remake does cut some of the dialogue in the scene, though it adds its own as well. The part missing in particular seems to be when James asks Eddie about the red pyramid thing and if he's friends with it. While I'm not exactly sure why this part was removed in the remake, it struck me as a weird question to ask in the first place, considering that the Pyramid Head doesn't exactly look friendly, which is perhaps why they removed it. I still prefer Remake's introduction to Remake more either way, as I do like the music that plays in the background. It's more sobering, and when combined with James's more empathetic voice acting and mannerisms, it suits the scene better, and while the original was also good for its time, it's clear that newer technologies have allowed Blooper Team to do things that Team Silent basically couldn't.
And Eddie, be careful.
Yeah, you too.
After solving more puzzles and exploring the apartment, you enter the room with Pyramid Head in this infamous scene where he's doing something with two mannequins. A lot of speculation has been said about this scene and what is actually happening. It's always been known as a rape scene, and it kind of does look like the Pyramid Head is doing something sexually to the mannequins, but the creature designer of the game, Masahiro Ito, has said it's not rape, but the Pyramid Head is quote unquote assaulting them. It's still a confusing statement, but when you actually understand what the Pyramid Head is and why it exists in the first place, it being a rape scene doesn't really make any sense. Visually, the monster looks the way it does because at some point before the story, James and Mary visited Silent Hill on vacation, and one of the locations they went to was the Historical Society Museum, which we'll visit later on ourselves. Inside of it are old paintings and artifacts from the town, but one painting is of an executioner, and it was this painting that put an impression on James, and so that explains the Pyramid Head's appearance. But what it actually represents I can only explain much later on, but for now here's a quote from the film Jacob's Ladder, which is actually how the designer came up with the idea of the Pyramid Head. Quote, "The only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of life, your memories, your attachments. They burn them all away. But they're not punishing you, they're freeing your soul. If you're frightened of dying and you're holding on, you'll see devils tearing your life away. But if you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels, freeing you from the earth. It's just a matter of how you look at it, that's all." Unquote. The character has become so iconic that Konami even uses it in other Silent Hill games and media, which betrays the lore. This has even annoyed the creator of the character as well as fans when it appears outside of Silent Hill 2. It just shows a lack of care for the franchise as a whole. You could argue that maybe the other characters from those games also saw the painting that James saw, but then usually when Pyramid Head or its alternative versions shows up, it behaves similarly across the games anyway, so it just doesn't make any sense at all when it shows up outside of Silent Hill 2. After Pyramid Head leaves the room, we enter the Blue Creek apartments. The cutscene of James crossing the gap to enter it gives off the impression that he's entering into something more sinister. It's here that you finally descend into a reality that's one step below the fog world. This is the other world. Similar to how the fog world manifests monsters from a person's subconscious, the other world not only does that, but it also changes the look and feel of a place based on the same thing. We come to a somewhat controversial topic with the remake for its depiction of the other world in Blue Creek apartment. When you enter it in remake, it becomes extremely obvious that you've entered some sort of new, deeper reality. The walls and the ground are covered in rusty metal gratings and it's completely black outside. The entire sky is like looking into a black void. The air looks almost toxic to breathe in and everything is much more dilapidated as well. There's also white sheets covering various parts of the environment, which seems to be a reference to Mary's sickbed and the hospital she was staying in. It's a cool looking environment for sure and a great contrast to Woodside, but I have to admit I wish it was a bit more subtle. At least for this section of the game, simply because of how the original depicted it. The original game's depiction of Blue Creek feels like an extension of the Woodside apartments. There might be more darkness, but it's very subtle, and the outside still looks like the fog world. Some of the hallways now have puddles of water because of a flooding, and I've read that this is supposedly how James's otherworld is meant to be depicted, which is with more water flooding parts of the environment. Another possible hint to this is the fight with the Pyramid Head. The sirens which are used to indicate an otherworld transition are used here, along with the stairs becoming unflooded as Pyramid Head descends them. It's a fairly dramatic change then with the remake's depiction of these apartments compared to the original. It's up for debate on whether Blue Creek was supposed to be an otherworld in the first place. I personally believe it wasn't, but because of remake's slower pacing, the developers likely felt the need to change it to one because seeing the same apartment environment for another few more hours would have worn out its welcome eventually. For this I agree with them. Still, I don't want to sound like I hate the change or anything, I just feel like it could have been done a different way than it currently is. I would have liked, for example, if the otherworld showed up for Blue Creek, but instead was maybe slowly seeping in as you progress through it. Or perhaps have it visually weaker altogether, and then once you reach the later parts of the game, as James's mind slowly unravels, the otherworld visually then becomes stronger in its depiction. The enemies themselves are now more aggressive and stronger in the other world with some new attacks they can pull off. I really liked how the line figure spits out a final gush of acid once it's been killed. It looks disgusting and does suit the depiction of the remake's otherworld with its toxic atmosphere. But you eventually come across a room with a hanging radio in it playing a more expanded version of the song Magdalene, which appears in the original game. The song, mixed with what James has experienced so far in the story, lends a real melancholic mood to the room. I kind of just stood there listening to this thing, and it's the moment that actually convinced me to begin writing down thoughts for this remake. The song's name is Anam Cara, which is an Irish word meaning soul friend. The note beside the grandfather clock is a good example of how hints work in this game when it comes to solving puzzles. Henry is hour, Mildred is minutes, and Scott is seconds. But embarrassingly, I didn't cop this until after I solved the puzzle just by looking at the hint on the wall beside the clock. It's not some amazingly complex thing to solve, it's probably the most obvious puzzle in the entire game, but it still gives that eureka feeling, which is something the Legend of Zelda games are well known for, or a puzzler game like the Picross series. Many puzzles in games today are too easy or just don't have the player use enough of their brain to figure them out. There's been too much hand holding as well with the characters themselves in games, sometimes giving hints on what to do if you take too long to figure a puzzle out, like in Horizon Forbidden West. It's not that every game has to have ultra hard puzzles or anything, but I found Silent Hill 2 Remake to be a refreshing change in this regard. If you're paying attention, the time on the clock itself and other ones throughout the game are the same. It's likely the time when Mary passed away at. After we've done some plumbing and solved more puzzles, we find Angela in a room lying down with a knife, and James tells her there is always another way, obviously alluding to suicide. She still hasn't found her mother, and she gets quickly annoyed when asked if she lived in this apartment. When Angela is getting up, you can see she's looking around cautiously though, as though she sees something that James can't. James asks her about the knife and she asks him if he can hold it for her, but she becomes extremely agitated and defensive when he tries to take it off her. At this stage, it's this scene that reveals Angela isn't well mentally and is afraid to even go near James. We'll be finding out why later on. The voice acting and how the scene is played out in Remake is good, but the original still holds up too. The dialogue differences are noticeable in this scene. In Remake, the dialogue tends to be slower, as James seems to be thinking about his words more carefully, whereas in the original he's more quick to explain what he means. When, for example, Angela asks him how he knows her mother lives in the apartment.
How do you know that?
Well, I just figured, 'cause this is where you're looking for her. How else would I know?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Angela leaves the knife, and this knife actually stays in your inventory. If you look at the knife too many times in the menu, it's actually one of the parameters that can change what ending you get. But we enter room 202, which is the moth room, and it now has a puzzle for us to figure out. In the original, while I had the moths lying around along with some taxidermy displays, there was no puzzle to solve. While the rooms in both games are numbered 202, Original's room 202 appears in Woodside, while the Remakes is now in Blue Creek. It's an example of Remake taking an area in the original and completely altering it, adding to it, and for the better too, I found most of the time. We're finally confronted by the Pyramid Head as our first boss of the game. Remake's fight takes place in some sort of storage area, while the original takes place in a small room with a flooded staircase. The arena of the new version has water leaking down from the ceiling, which gets progressively worse as the fight goes on, which I think is a cool detail. But once Pyramid Head is defeated and leaves, the Otherworld alarm plays before stopping along with the water leaking down from the ceiling. Once you exit the area, you're back outside into the fog world. This seems to be another confirmation that water has something to do with James's Otherworld. The original's ending to this fight is more interesting, however. The Pyramid Head simply walks down the flooded staircase with no bother at all, and I found this to be unsettling. Considering how the monsters in this game are manifested from James' subconscious, and maybe I'm going down the rabbit hole too much with this observation, but perhaps this is Pyramid Head retreating back into James' subconsciousness, symbolically. The fanbase has a history of overthinking scenes like this. Maybe him walking into the water is just simply meant to be unsettling, and that's literally all there is to it. Back outside, we travel through to the other side of the town previously inaccessible to us, and eventually meet the little girl who kicked away the key in the apartment, Laura. She tells James he didn't love Mary, so it seems she may have known her somehow. It's around this period of the game that things begin to slowly unravel. The letter Laura is holding will also become important later on. She seems to have some sort of disdain for James in the remake, while in the original she's more of a brat who just likes to annoy him. The difference in demeanour could be explained by the advancement of voice acting and writing in games, meaning no longer do developers need to exaggerate characters in order to have a specific personality. Laura herself seems unaffected by Silent Hill. Presumably in her version of Silent Hill, there are no monsters and everyday life in the town is still business as usual. Otherwise, I find it hard to believe a child would be roaming dark apartments and foggy empty towns on their own without a care in the world. When I was younger, I wouldn't have explored abandoned buildings on my own in the sunny daylight, never mind dark abandoned buildings at night. Only if I was with friends would we do that sort of thing, and even then, sometimes there are some buildings you just wouldn't go into. They had a creepy vibe to them. But we reach Rosewater Park and meet another character, Maria, who looks very similar to Mary in both appearance and voice, as well as her name even. Her behaviour around James is strange and very flirty, but he shrugs her off. We don't really get much information on Maria, like who she is and why she's here, and it might just be me, but I also felt some unease with this character when I first watched this scene, both in the original and remake. Her whole demeanour and how she behaves around James, despite being in an abandoned town full of monsters, makes no sense. She joins James and they go to find the special place Mary mentions in the letter at the start of the game, and as we're travelling, Maria will comment on various locales, giving us more lore about some of the town. We eventually make our way to the Jack's Inn motel to explore inside, which wasn't possible in the original. There's 2 Easter eggs to be found here in the inn. Room 106 actually shows up in Silent Hill 3, and you can spot one of the main characters' hat in this room. Later on, if you return to this room after finishing the hospital, you can get a PS5 trophy when you inspect the wall, which now has some sort of religious markings on it. The other Easter egg is in room 108. Maria will actually find an outfit she likes, and it's the exact same one Maria wore in the original game, as the remake has slightly altered the appearance of it. Another nice Easter egg close to the inn is the mansion that appears in the original game's side story where you play as Maria. You can't enter it or interact with it, and Maria is unsettled by the building. When I got to the mansion, I was honestly surprised you couldn't go in, considering the developers went to the trouble of modelling the building in great detail. The gate door also interestingly looks similar to the door that leads into the Blue Creek apartments when James has to cross the gap. We eventually reach the iconic Heaven's Night, which has been expanded on in the remake with more rooms to explore, as well as a new cutscene with Maria. This is one of the locations in the remake that I felt was greatly improved compared to the original, and in a way that makes sense too, with the new backstage area and dressing rooms. But also the new cutscene gives us more of a glimpse into James's character. I like the neon sign that says Dream being somewhat prominent in the cutscene, along with the song that plays, which really gives the entire scene a sort of dreamlike feeling.
Just for a little while. Catch our breath before we head back out there.
I don't have time to take a break. Mary could be out there, waiting for me.
In the new cutscene, Maria offers James a drink, and he seems very tempted by it. He may have used alcohol before coming to Silent Hill to take the stress off of losing his wife. I was kind of surprised though at how minuscule Heaven's Night is in the original game compared to remakes. It has no cutscene at all, and you're basically just in and out in a minute or so. It's kind of disappointing, to be honest, when you consider that it's featured in the official art for the game, as well as having its own song, along with the connection to Maria's backstory where it seems she may have worked as a dancer. So I'm glad overall that they expanded on it, and it looks graphically impressive too in the remake. After Heaven's Night, we reach the park that is supposedly the special place Maria was talking about. The story she tells about the statue is interesting. It's not integral to the plot or characters, but you could speculate the meaning behind the story in various ways. If we say the sailor is James, the candle lady is Mary, and then the lake is Silent Hill, you could interpret it as a cautionary tale. Personally, I think that while it does have some symbolism going on, I also think the entire reason Maria even tells James the story is also to emotionally hurt him in some way too, as he's obviously in Silent Hill to find his wife just as the sailor is to the lady on the island. Reaching the movie theatre, we see Eddie and Laura talking to each other. In the original, it was Pete's Bowl-O-Rama where you found them, and it's an interesting change. It was maybe done so that we can see Eddie eating ice cream, which will make sense later on in the story. You can hear them talking, and it gives us more background on Eddie, who says people call him weird all the time and that the police were after him before coming to Silent Hill. Eddie's mannerisms in this scene is cold when talking to James, almost like he's annoyed with something after James makes a comment about Eddie getting his appetite back.
Get around to it yet.
Well, at least you got your appetite back.
You can see the subtle reaction of anger on Eddie's face, and when asked if he's coming along, he seems to be a little agitated by that question as well. It's likely that he was made fun of about his weight, and so thinks James is also doing the same to him, which is why he's annoyed. Before we move on to Brookhaven Hospital, I just want to mention that the posters for the films advertised in the movie theatre are references to the game's story in some way. The poster for Return to Owl Creek Bridge is a reference to the short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is about a man who escapes execution by hanging, who then reaches his wife only for the ending to reveal the escape was an illusion all along. The poster non-existence seems to be a reference to Mary not being alive and that James is deluding himself into thinking she is. And the last poster, I Was Here, depicts the tunnel where James first encounters the Line figure in the original game, as well as the title referencing it directly. Having to enter the Brookhaven Hospital to find Laura, this is the second main location in the game, so we'll be here for a little while. This hospital was used for mentally unwell patients, and throughout it we'll find their notes, rooms, and what the director of the hospital was up to. The old basement from the original game has now been expanded on in Remake, and we have to get a generator working again so we can use the lift to reach the other floors. With the lift working again, we reach the second floor and Maria goes to lay down on a bed. She's taken pills and seems to be tired or ill. It's obviously a reference to Mary, and while Maria may actually be sick, I believe the intent here is also to manipulate James's trauma too. If you return to this room every now and then to check up on her, it's another parameter for what ending you get. The poster outside this room about palliative care is another reference to Mary because the specific illness she would have had would have required such care. Walking up this hallway, something's creeping around the corner and it's a new enemy, the Bubblehead Nurse. The Bubblehead Nurse is obviously sexualized appearances due to James's desires for other women. Probably the nurses working at the hospital Mary was staying in itself. But what's interesting about the design for me is the red paper attached to their mouths. It looks similar to the red paper used to save the game, and you can interpret this design as some kind of suffocation or being unable to speak. When you see the first save point back in the forest, James seems to be in pain when looking at it. Perhaps then the paper on the nurse's mouth is James's subconscious or the town itself trying to remind him of Mary's pain or his own trauma. The head on the nurse's looks balloon-like and swollen, which is similar to Mary's when her condition worsened. This can be seen in one of the endings for the game, and there also seems to be fluid inside their heads as well. In the official artwork there is a shape of a face underneath the skin too, which backs up the theory of suffocation. The remake adds a new frame freezing effect to their head movements, which I believe might be inspired from the movies and other Silent Hill games that also had nurses. I like the effect as it looks like it's moving in and out of dimensions or something. It also makes it harder to get a headshot off, so it serves a gameplay purpose as well, which is a bonus. Similar to the Pyramid Head, the nurses have also become an iconic character of the franchise and usually appear in other games. While this kind of makes more sense than Pyramid Head when you consider the story of the first game, the issue is after the second game they still have a sexualized design with a face hidden underneath the skin, which should really only be coming from James's subconscious and not anyone else's. It reeks of desperation from Konami. I don't look at these monsters in future games and think how cool it is that they brought them back, catering to nostalgia in this kind of way. It just feels cheap. It tells me Konami doesn't trust their staff to keep designing new and interesting monsters or characters that have a widespread appeal, so they try to milk them for all they're worth. And of course the sex appeal of marketing is also a likely reason too. Having found the shotgun, we make our way to the nurse's lounge, and an interesting Easter egg can be found here. The TV shown static is making clicking noises in different intervals, and it was recently discovered that all the powered on TVs in the game are actually transmitting Morse code. I don't want to spoil what this one transmits for now because it will be explained in the theory section of this video later on. I really like hidden stuff like this put into games in this subtle way though. I'm more surprised I didn't cop it until after beating the game and doing more research for this video. There's likely many classic games out there that have well hidden secrets no one on this planet has even discovered yet. But unfortunately, the internet, as great as it can be, has made many of these secrets much easier to find, whether it's due to data mining or so many people being able to communicate to each other across forums and the like. Rumoured secrets too, like Mew being under the truck or the Bigfoot rumour in GTA San Andreas, just don't really happen anymore, and that's unfortunate. The director's office is where we find the recorded message from the director, who is having trouble trying to figure out what exactly is wrong with 3 of his patients. You do get to find out what some of the patients were going through in the hospital, and at least one of them is actually in some form of the fog world or the other world, which is a pretty unsettling prospect. The nurse and director think the patient is insane when he's actually in another reality altogether that they can't see. Heading up to the rooftop, we run into the Pyramid Head in this cutscene. This is one of the bigger changes compared to the original. In that game, as you're exploring this area, you eventually go over to the fence and then Pyramid Head appears out of nowhere in gameplay to throw you off the balcony. The sky is pitch black here with no fog and could indicate that the other world possibly follows the Pyramid Head, as the other world's only other appearance in the original's hospital is after the fight with the boss. I can't say which approach to the scene is better. I like both for their own unique take. Remake's cutscene is done very well and gave me a bit of a fright, but I do like in the original game how he just shows up unceremoniously with nowhere for the player to run, which caused me to panic. We catch up to Laura and James asks her why she's running away from him. It's revealed that Laura met Mary when she was sick in the hospital and is a friend of hers. This also explains how Laura knew Mary's name earlier and accuses James of not caring about her. It's interesting then that Laura acts the way she does around James, trying to run away from him and also assuming he would yell at her, which is what he kind of does when he thinks she's lying to him. It indicates then perhaps James and Mary might have had a bad relationship towards the end of her life, and she told Laura about how James was behaving at the time. The drawings Laura made on the wall depicts two rabbits and a wolf stalking them. Presumably the wolf is James and the rabbits are Mary and Laura. It gives us another indication of their relationship towards the end and how Laura feels about James. Previously in the apartments it was just two happy rabbits with no wolf, as James and Laura didn't meet at this point. Laura reveals the letter she was holding is also from Mary and that she's hidden it inside a room, but James falls for the trap and he's now locked inside. There is a monster here which James can see but Laura can't, confirming once again that she is not in the same reality as James.
A big lying fart face. See a fart face?
The bosses in the game are more designed with symbolism than the regular enemies. Take the Flesh Lips boss for example. It's encountered in the hospital and looks like a restraining bed frame with a body bag inside of it. At the end of the bag is a human lip, hence the name. The flesh itself looks all broken up and lumpy, which is what was happening to Mary's skin. The lip could signify silence, with Mary being too ill to speak, or as revealed later on in the game, she was verbally abusive towards James, so it could represent anger as well. After the fight, a second one grabs James and pulls him into the other world. The cutscene depicting the change to the other world is interesting, as it appears James is now lying on a gurney and hears Mary calling out his name before fading to white, and then we see our otherworld version of the hospital appear. James being pulled up into the ceiling, Mary calling his name along with a fade to white could signify some sort of ascension to heaven before being pulled back into hell with the otherworld. This fade to white happens a few times, so perhaps there's some sort of struggle going on between heaven and hell and Mary is trying to influence the outcome, which is why you hear her calling out his name. The design of the otherworld in Brookhaven is similar to the apartments. There's rusted metal and fencing everywhere, as well as sheets covering everything along with damp walls and barbed wire everywhere. It has a more violent look to it compared to Blue Creek, and it could be because of the more direct connection with Mary in the hospital, so the manifestation of this particular otherworld is even stronger as a result. But we get to the main area now, which has a locked box. It's actually the same one you see in one of the patients' rooms in the original, but now it's become the centerpiece puzzle of progressing through this world. We meet the otherworld version of the Bubblehead Nurse, and these ones are far more aggressive and dangerous than their Fogworld counterparts. The design on them now has more bandaging on their head and a brown mud-like substance on their bodies. In the original it seemed to be dried blood and could possibly be the same here, but I'm not sure. It looks like some sort of vomit or bile. The coloration of whatever it is does match in better with the new art of Remake's Otherworld, so either way I can see why it looks less like blood in this version. In the original it's definitely now an otherworld you enter, and the way this version depicts the otherworld is a bit different. There seems to be more of a dried blood look to the walls with some sheets covering against them, as well as the doors. But it's not as in your face as Remake's Otherworld. But still, it looks interesting in its own right. I can't really say which one I prefer though. Again, I like the subtle depiction of the originals, but I have to admit the more violent, aggressive look of Remake suits that game well. I think it's a credit to Remake that they went for something different that also achieves the same goal as the original from both a aesthetic and lore perspective. It's an area where many remakes mess up because they misunderstand the original intention. Unlocking every chain from the box, we find that it has nothing inside, but then a sheet falls from the wall, revealing the Lady of the Night door. We have to find 2 rings to put on each finger. From what's known, it doesn't matter which order the rings go on, which is strange. Usually if the game gives you a choice like this, it affects the ending in some way, but apparently it doesn't. The game show scene in the elevator is obviously unsettling because of how contrasting it is to the rest of the game's tone. The game show host might sound enthusiastic and cheerful, but I like how there's a kind of undertone threat of violence with how he speaks, and I like to think it's maybe the entity of the town itself talking to James directly.
And receive the punishment. It's all in the hands of our lucky contestant, James Sunderland. James, are you ready to play trick or treat?
We find Maria again, and she lashes out at James for not caring about her enough. It's becoming clear that Maria is just manipulating James at this point, and you can tell in Remake just based on the body language that James isn't receptive at all to what she's trying to do. It's a real advantage that new hardware has over the older ones. There's more accurate facial animations and more bones to move around in the animation rigs that allows more subtle movements that can tell us how a character feels without them having to even say a word, and Remake uses it to give James more nuance in his character. This scene in the original uses CG because the in-game graphics just weren't good enough to achieve what the developers wanted. I find Maria in these CG cutscenes to honestly have an evil look to her. Just something about her eyes is off-putting to me, and I'm not sure whether it's intentional or not. I prefer how James acts in remake scenes, but I actually prefer Maria's more angry response in the original, as you can imagine from her perspective of having to hide from the monsters, only to see James react less about her well-being and more about his dead wife being found. As we make our way through the hospital, it somehow begins to rain inside of this hallway. Maria is unfazed by this strange occurrence and makes a joke about it, which annoys James. It's an indication that something is not normal in the more deeper sense than usual. Gaining access to the Lady of the Night door, we see Maria is afraid to enter it. It's almost as though she knows something James doesn't, and sure enough, further ahead, Pyramid Head appears and gives chase to us. Maria slips right before we get to the elevator and is impaled. James is obviously devastated and falls to his knees. He's now lost someone who looks and sounds just like his dead wife, which must feel like losing the same person twice. The original game's setup with this chase scene is less cinematic than the remakes. Pyramid Head just shows up in game like he usually does and gives chase straight away. There's no fanfare or anything, and Maria doesn't seem to care about walking into the Lady of the Night door either, which is much smaller and placed unceremoniously compared to the remakes. However, the death scene is actually more visceral in the original, as Maria cries out to James multiple times as he tries to pry the elevator door open. Remake's depiction is still shocking though, and has the advantage of using a more complex facial animation to convey that shock onto the characters' faces themselves. But we're finally at the end of the hospital, and in the original game, the song mentioned earlier in the apartment, Anam Cara, originated from this part of the game, and I think it's done well here, considering how James must feel at this point. Stuff like this in 2001 is what helped push this game above many others, creating these melancholic moments with no cutscene or anything, just letting the player soak in the atmosphere. Reading this page in the book from one of the directors, it seems that one of the patients was in the fog world or other world while still being able to interact with the doctors at the same time, similar to how James and Laura can interact as mentioned earlier. The interesting thing here is that the patient seems happy in this world, and since Laura seems to be unfazed by the town's horrors, I have to wonder if some people experience Silent Hill's different realities in a more positive setting. We see a clear difference between remake and original when we walk outside to the otherworld version of the town in search of Laura. In remake we have rain, metal grating on the ground and walls, more collapsed streets along with dilapidated buildings. It's interesting to see the town in this state as it contrasts well against the fog world. The original is mostly just dark in terms of difference, but I find this to be unsettling as much as the detail added in by remake. It's completely pitch dark, and if James had no flashlight he wouldn't survive at all in this version. I'm not saying original is better here either, it's just that sometimes less is more. If I was put into a situation where I had to pick between traversing the remake or original's otherworld town, I'd pick remakes, simply for it not being in total darkness compared to the originals. Heading into this tunnel we meet a new enemy, the Mandarin. The arms and face of this monster look like a closed human lip, which could be a reference to helplessness, and the fact that the rose under a cage could be some sort of desire to escape. Perhaps James's need to escape the pain he was going through mentally as Mary was dying, or literally the town itself as he currently traverses it. The introduction of these enemies was good as well. You're entering a tunnel and you can hear a noise in the distance getting closer and closer until it gets loud enough that you should be able to see it. But it's not until you look down that you can actually see the monster. They're the rarest enemies in the game and they don't really have much going on because of their limited movement under the cage, but they're interesting nonetheless. We find an ominous note telling us that if we want the truth then we must keep marching on. And making our way into Neely's bar, we see a message above the jukebox telling James if he wants to see Mary, he should just die. But he won't be going to the same place as Mary, it'll be somewhere else. It's a cruel message for anyone to have to see about their dead loved one, and especially for James, considering what he's gone through in the story so far. But we're at the stage of the story now where things have begun to snowball, not just visually, but narratively as well. And soon we'll literally be entering the black abyss. Just before you leave the bar, you can find a neat flashback moment with the map from the original game on the counter. At the park we run into Angela again, who seems to have calmed down from her last encounter, but once you mention you're searching for Laura, having been reminded of her experiences as a child, she becomes upset and runs away. This note with the key is interesting. It seems as though the director of Brookhaven wrote it, but he not only directs James to this key, but in the note actually addresses him by name too, which is strange. The director seemed very determined to help his patients, so I wonder if he somehow knows about the town's other dimensions. Maybe the director is the actual town itself guiding James along this path. It's hard to say. We're now at the Silent Hill Historical Society, and the first thing we see directly ahead of us is a painting of the Pyramid Head, who is looking directly back at us as well. It's here we see how James was able to manifest the Pyramid Head visually, and maybe the line figures too, as they seem to be the ones being executed or tortured. You can explore other rooms in the museum for other small bits of lore about the town, but it's time to descend some stairways into Toluca Prison. The overly long stairway into this place gives off the impression of entering some sort of abyss, something beyond the fog world and otherworld themselves, and we begin the prison area proper by jumping into a dark hole, and then another. Even though James is hesitant to jump down these holes, he goes and does it anyway, which indicates maybe he doesn't care anymore about his own well-being. The second one we enter looks like a prison hallway flipped vertically, and at this point reality itself is beginning to break down. We meet Eddie here in the prison cafeteria, and once again he's beside a dead body which has fresh blood underneath it along with some ice forming around it. Eddie now has a gun and explains he shot the dead man because he was startled by him and how he looked at him. But James refutes Eddie's reasons for killing someone, and as soon as he does, Eddie immediately points the gun at him. It seems Eddie feels easily threatened when challenged on his idea of killing someone for basically no reason. It seems Eddie was bullied to some extent in the past, and victims of bullying would naturally be defensive over small things like this because for them it means more. The trauma of being bullied can make a person nervous around people in general because they don't want to go through the pain all over again. It's on their mind often, and so they shut any attempts of it down even if the person they're speaking to has no intentions of bullying. This doesn't excuse Eddie's behaviour, however, but it could be an explanation for why he's acting out the way he is. An interesting coincidence or detail can be found when we first met Eddie back in Woodside. The apartment he's getting sick in has a room where someone was aspiring to be a football player, and there's a clear juxtaposition here. Eddie was likely bullied by jocks, so I believe the placement of this room was intentional. The game barely has any apartments that feel personalised as well, but this happens to be a rare exception. After James confronts Eddie about the body, Eddie says he was just joking, but considering there's a dead body lying there, it would be inappropriate to joke about killing someone, and there's an air of uncertainty on whether he actually did kill the person or not. The depiction of the scene in the original game is very similar, with some differences, like James is more confrontational and shocked by what he sees, and Eddie is more defensive. There's one thing I'm not sure I enjoy about the scene though, and that is it switches from real-time rendering to CG twice mid-conversation, which looks really jarring and out of place. Like most cutscenes in the original, this one is over fairly fast compared to remakes thanks to the faster dialogue. The cafeteria is interesting too because it's our first glimpse into another character's other world. If you've been paying attention to Eddie in the previous cutscenes, you'll notice that you can see his breath, and that's because his other world is a frozen hellscape, and you can see some of it seeping into James's world in his cafeteria. It could be happening because as the emotions run deeper and stronger for the characters as the story goes on, their other world can seep into another's. The original, however, doesn't depict Eddie's breath nor his other world until the next time we see him, but I prefer the remake in this regard because it has a mystique to it. We start the prison area proper, and this location has had maybe the biggest expansion in remake, and we can even see a new enemy that was not found in the original as well. I like the details in this mini cathedral that suggest how the prisoners were tortured and likely forced to confess sins they didn't do. Praying was seemingly mandatory as well because there are straps to keep them all seated. The local cult was forcibly indoctrinating them, and the entire prison feels more like a torture chamber than anything else. The town was historically known for its witch hunts, and there are even monuments in the town describing how the local blood swamp got its name, which is from the executioners washing their bloody tools in it. But as we'll explore the prison, we'll find 4 doors with different animals on them that we have to unlock. For this area of the game, it's the central puzzle to solve before we can proceed. The outdoor courtyard, which like the original has an amazing audio trick where it plays the sound of an enemy rushing you even though nothing is there. The remake, thanks to its superior audio on the PS5 versus the PS2, makes it feel like this ghost is rushing you from different angles. It seems to be a ghost of a horse, and in the original game you get a horseshoe in the prison to open up a door on the ground. Horses were used as an execution method where they would drag the prisoner to the gallows for hanging, or literally using 2 horses to rip the prisoner in half. It's pretty brutal. There are also the ghosts of prisoners in some cells in the original game, while Remake itself adds a cell full of religious symbols and books that has a monster in the background making strange noises. All of this is to say, I kind of wish Silent Hill 2 had more paranormal activity going on, as it can be unsettling not knowing the unknown. Remake's new enemy, the spider mannequin, is a variant of the regular mannequin that can crawl up walls and hide in darker parts of the ceilings. There's not actually much to say about this variant though. The big difference is more in gameplay than visual. They do have more bandaging on their body, which is a reference to Mary's skin as it was becoming scarred, but that's about it. I think the animation on them does a good job of making them more insect-like though, and there's also spider webbing around some of the cells where you encounter them too, although that could be because the prison has been abandoned for so long. It's surprising there isn't any more new enemies in Remake. Many developers would likely find it hard to resist stamping their own unique design onto such a classic title. It usually results in fan backlash because of misinterpretation of the original intent, but Blooper have done a fantastic job at Remake in this regard, I found. As we overload the electric chair, it trips the alarm, and I couldn't help but notice the colour usage of red throughout the game, whether it's the save paper, the red glow around Pyramid Head when he's nearby, the blood red paint we'll find later on, or even the jacket Maria wears is sort of red too. Red could be a representation for emotion, particularly anger, and James up to this point has given hints of being easily irritated, whether it's Maria's flirting or accusing Laura of lying when she has a letter from Mary. Maybe it's just a colour they chose, and it's not like any other games haven't used red as a sign of danger or to get the player's attention, but I feel for this game it seems deliberately chosen. Shortly after the alarm, we find a book that talks about a tourist cruiser ship that goes missing in Toluca Lake on a foggy day, and despite extensive police searches, no trace of it is ever found, or the remains of its passengers. So it seems to me that Silent Hill's fog world can sometimes seep into the normal world and drag innocent people into it, in this case an entire boat and its tourists. We go to the Hornless Ox door, which gives us access to the second floor, and reading a guard's journal about how one prisoner is somehow escaping a cell and threatening another. They search the offending prisoner's cell but find no way of him being able to escape. Eventually we find out that the offending prisoner did escape and has killed the other prisoner he threatened. And as you're finding the murdered prisoner's notes scattered around, you're also following his route to try escape his death, which is pretty unsettling. Once the 4 prison sections are done, we get the sword from the statue and now need to figure out the gallows puzzle. You have to match each piece of the poems correctly with another and then choose the correct noose to pull. Failing to do that, you'll be sent down to an area full of monsters, which is easy to escape. Once you've figured out the correct noose to pull, you drop down to a corridor with more jail cells and a morgue. For the 3rd time now, James has to jump down another hole and then another. We go down this lift and the room we enter looks like a normal apartment, like something you'd see from Woodside. We're now out of the prison and into an area known as the Labyrinth, which seems to not just be a manifestation of James's subconscious, but also other people's too, which we'll soon see. Just before we meet Angela though, we read a newspaper clipping about a dead lumberjack who was stabbed in the neck. The room he was killed in had signs of a struggle, but there was no murder weapon, and along with his cash being untouched, so it's considered a potential homicide. We hear Angela yelling and come into an apartment hallway. Entering one of the rooms, we find Angela talking to nothing until we hear a noise behind us, and it's Angela's father who takes the form of a monster. The Abstract Daddy is probably the most shocking design in the game because of the context behind it. It's based on Angela's father sexually abusing her, and design wise even looks like a sexual position on the bed. This is why the newspaper clippings were outside the room. It was Angela who killed her father, who was the lumberjack in the paper. The fact that I was shocked by its design in 2025 makes me wonder about how people took this boss and other elements of the game back in 2001. It's possible the Abstract Daddy might be Angela's equivalent of the Pyramid Head and has been stalking her throughout the game. Since what we see is James's manifestation, then it appears based on its design it represents a sexual position on the bed and is likely James wanting to be intimate with Mary but is unable to. It's a grotesque design, and I think they were brave putting it in the game all the way back in 2001. And as the fight progresses, the walls begin to tear down and we see piston machinery and skin on the wall, along with some breathing noises. The sexual connotation is obvious. The original game's boss fight took place in a small room, but they've really extended it in Remake to also be a chase fight too. And if there was one area of Remake you would assume they toned down the nature of the sexual imagery, it's absolutely this one. But they've actually kind of ramped it up, the imagery, more so than the original. The boss itself has a unique property in that it's one of the only monsters in the game that both James and another person see at the same time. Once you defeat the boss, Angela kicks it while it's dying and smashes a TV over it. You can understand her anger, and this explains why she's been defensive with James the entire game. James tells her he doesn't want to hurt her, he just wants his wife back, but suddenly Angela then accuses James of not wanting Mary to be around anymore, which he angrily denies.
Admit it. You didn't want her around anymore.
No.
You probably found someone else.
No.
We're now deeper into the labyrinth and we see a strange wall of flesh blocking us from heading that way, so going the other way and through this door we find Maria, who is somehow alive after being impaled by the Pyramid Head, back at the hospital. She's in a jail cell beside a bed with an IV bag, and the symbolism here is obvious. The jail cell represents Mary's inability to leave the bed in hospital. Maria has no recollection about being killed though, and is speaking strangely with no emotion in her voice. She then asks James if he remembers the videotape in the hotel. She asks him if he wants to touch her, and James at this point is confused. You can practically see from his face that he might be having some sort of eternal meltdown, and you can't really blame him at this point. Reality itself is starting to collapse in various ways, from other people's manifestations appearing in James's world, to James jumping down endless holes, to Maria now somehow being alive, as well as the labyrinth's design itself making zero sense. The way the game progresses from being normal at the start, albeit with monsters and such, to now being unsure for even in Silent Hill anymore is done well. Many games with similar situations in their stories usually go from 0 to 100 too quick, but Silent Hill 2 takes small steps first before taking its big leaps. Looking for a way to break Maria out of the cell, we go back up the stairs and there's now this cube building that can be moved around with a rotating controller. The imagery here as the cube building is being manipulated is really neat, but unsettling, as we know it obviously shouldn't be really possible. As we manipulate it, we gain access to different parts of the labyrinth, with the goal being to progress past the flesh wall. This is the labyrinth's main puzzle that needs to be solved. We have to get past 3 areas and each one ends with us jumping down a hole and then back to the area where the rotating controller is. James is being tested here and each area seems to be a trial. The imagery is strange at this point and seems to be fragments of James's subconscious. One area is themed around the apartment otherworld with a ton of insects. One has you going into a cave system, and another is an apartment with enemies that ambush you as you try to make your way through various rooms. The cave area is where we'll find Pyramid Head chasing us and find what appears to be his lair. You can see the caged bodies from the Historical Society painting, and there are numerous scissors on the table. I mention this because if you look closely at Pyramid Head's knife, it's actually more like one half of a scissors rather than a sword or a joint knife. This detail is actually referenced at the start of the game when you explore the barbers with this note and scissors beside it. So presuming then that it's true, we're in some sort of manifestation of James's subconscious, then the third area we visit actually shows his mind falling apart as we go through each hallway and as the walls come down. It's amazing how up to this point a lot of the tense moments have actually been because of how quiet the game has been and dark it is, but this third area of the labyrinth is the opposite. The noise itself and the red colour is a total contrast to the mostly quiet atmosphere of the rest of the game. We enter room 208 only to find it's the prison cell with Maria in it. This room number is the same one we find Pyramid Head in back at the apartments, and it looks like he's killed her again here by beating her to death with various bruisings seen on her body. There's also strange tissue scars on her face as well, which are in the same spot as Mary had hers. Like Mary being unable to escape her disease, Maria was unable to escape this prison cell. As James is sobbing, he stops and seems to have a sudden moment of realization. The cube controller and building are now gone and have been replaced by Pyramid Head's knife, which we can pick up and use to get past the wall of flesh. We strangely find ourselves in a small graveyard now, and reading the gravestones, there's some interesting names on them. One of them is of Walter Sullivan, the main antagonist of Silent Hill 4. He's mentioned rarely throughout Silent Hill 2 as he was the one who murdered the 2 children that we hear about in the hospital elevator. There's a few other connections to this game that Silent Hill 4 adds, like James's father appearing in that game. The other gravestones are of Eddie and Angela, and one belongs to James as well, and it's his one that we jump into. We wake up and enter a long hallway that is full of blood all over the walls and ceiling, and then find Eddie. He's talking to a corpse, and once again he is holding his gun. You can really get a glimpse of his frozen otherworld here too. He's behaving psychotic and even points his gun at James, who is fed up at this point, and punches him to make him snap out of his behaviour. He tells Eddie he needs help, but Eddie is too far gone at this point.
You need help, Eddie.
Don't get all holy on me, James. This town called you too.
It's interesting that James in Remake doesn't really do much at all to provoke him, while in the original he's somewhat more belligerent. He confronts him about eating pizza when there are monsters around, the "forget you" comment as he leaves Eddie to find Laura, and then James asks him if he's gone nuts, which only angers Eddie more. James is simply more confrontational and dismissive of Eddie in the original compared to the remake. I'm not sure why they made it this way though. Perhaps the facial animations are now doing more of the lifting that words would have been doing back then. Before we fight Eddie, the corpses in this room have a striking resemblance to James, just like the other dead bodies around Silent Hill. I can't say for certain if the models are identical, but either way I'll be talking about them in a dedicated section later on in the video. We go inside to fight Eddie and eventually kill him. James is shocked that he's now killed another human being, and he looks at his hands the same way he did at the very beginning of the game in the public bathroom. As the camera focuses on his face, it looks like he's trying to remember something deep in his thoughts. The contrast with the original for this scene is significant. James speaks out Eddie's name to see if he's okay after killing him, and then is in more shock that he's killed another human before mentioning whether or not Mary really did die 3 years ago. This scene is a perfect example for me where the remake is superior to the original, and it's simply due to how the developers of the remake utilised the newer technology to punch across the same emotions and reaction without James even having to say a word. Again, it's not that the original is bad, but I do wonder from playing remake, what would Team Silent's cutscene direction would have been if they were given the current technology. We leave the warehouse room to find ourselves outside in the Silent Hill boat docks, and it's the fog world again. Obviously the geography makes no sense. We just descended down under the lake to a prison and then descended into many holes only to be on top of the lake again. We get on a boat to paddle our way to the hotel and follow a light in the distance which is guiding us. It reminds me of the earlier story about the woman imprisoned on the island who used the candlelight to guide the sailor to her. You could say the sailor is James, as he's guided to the light by Mary, who is supposedly waiting in the hotel, and in fact this is somewhat insinuated earlier on in the game. Back in apartment 201 in Woodside, we see a room that is identical to the one Mary was staying in for one of the endings, right down to the teapot on the table. In the living room area you can see 3 photos depicting a man on a sailing boat, and with each photo the weather gets progressively worse. On the left side is a photo of the lighthouse and the lonely female there being stalked by a wolf in the shadows. The symbolism is clear. Arriving at the Lakeview Hotel, the garden is in good condition, as is the outside of the hotel itself, which suggests it's been maintained somehow. The atmosphere is also serene in a way. There's no monsters and it's overall peaceful. Even the fog looks different. It's more like mist you'd get near water rather than the town fog we're used to, which does make sense considering we're beside a lake. But there is something interesting we'll find out later on about the hotel that may explain the fog's appearance right now. Heading on inside, we find a map of the hotel and there's a message saying that someone's waiting for us in room 312. I should talk about the original's depiction of the hotel before we dive in proper though. The hotel's art design in this version is quite different compared to remakes. The hotel is very dark with little to no light sources and is artistically consistent with the rest of the game, but this has a downside. When I saw the hotel in remake, it was a nice contrast with the rest of the game and felt fresh to just look at, whereas in original it just felt a bit uninspired if I'm honest, to be in more dark hallways, and considering we're at the very end of the game as well. We find Laura in this room playing the piano and she's starting to warm up to James. She finally gives James the letter she's been holding the entire game, however it's not for James but for Laura. Mary tells her to give James a chance, which suggests that they must have spoken about him in the hospital and how the relationship was getting worse. One interesting difference from the original's letter to Laura is we find out that she has no family and is an orphan. Mary wanted to adopt her as well. It's a strange thing to cut, to be honest, and I can't really figure out why, because it tells us that Laura and Mary didn't just know each other but were obviously good friends, to the point where Mary was going to adopt her. Having read the full letter, James asks Laura how old she is, and she says she turned 8 just last week, meaning the letter is at least a week old, which means Mary couldn't have died 3 years ago. Laura has another letter from Mary, but this time it's for James. The envelope has no letter, however, and Laura must have lost it, so she goes looking for it. As Laura has warmed up to James, so too has her drawings, which can be seen on the window. It no longer depicts James as a wolf trying to hunt Mary and herself, but is now of a happy wolf and rabbit being friends. Another cool detail in this room is the song James can play on the piano. It's Anam Cara, the song we heard on the hanging radio back in the apartments. The cutscene direction here is a little different in the original. The letter to Laura has no voice acting and has to be read by the player in a menu, whereas in Remake it's James who's doing the reading. It also shows Laura happily skipping around, giving us more of an impression that the world she's in is safe compared to James's. But the central puzzle to solve here is a music box where we need to place 3 fairy tale princesses into it in order to make a complete song. We also have to find 2 apples that can help us piece together a magic mirror, which gives us a quote similar to the one said by the evil queen in Snow White. There's a fairy tale theme going on with the hotel, and combined with the serenity of the location, I can't help but wonder about the symbolism going on here. The ripe apple could represent Maria, whereas the rotten is Mary as she's dying. The hotel itself could be an enchanted castle, while the mirror could be James believing he's the fair hero, with the mirror thinking otherwise. I could be overthinking it, but it's fun to speculate in this game, and many of the fans have. After getting the Snow White piece, we stop by room 217, which, like the prison courtyard with the ghost horse, this one has empty bird cages, but you can still hear the birds fluttering around inside of them. From reading online, this seems to be a reference to Silent Hill 1. If not a reference to that game, then it could be more symbolism. Birds usually represent freedom, and since the cages are locked, it could symbolise Mary's inability to move around because she was too ill. It could also tie into the princess fairy tales cliche, where birds are often used in those stories to help guide the princess in trouble to safety. In all likelihood, however, it's probably just a reference to Silent Hill 1, but when I look at rooms like this, I know a developer has gone to the trouble of making the various graphics, sounds and layout. I can't help but suspect there's more to it than there likely is, which is very easy to do with this game. Speaking of potential Easter eggs, in the original there's a room with a locked briefcase that has photos of people on the bed, and if you look closely they appear to be of Mary, Laura, James and a lion figure monster. I think this is just an Easter egg or the developers reusing assets due to the old resolution the CRTs used to mask what the photos really were. It's strange, but with an emulator you can resolve the detail much easier. The absolute strangest thing in the original's hotel, however, has to be the addition of the abstract daddy boss becoming a regular enemy, like something you would see towards the end of an old beat 'em up game. And while we do meet up with Angela again in the hotel later on, I still think it's completely out of place. I would have to guess there were time constraints at this point in the game's development, because it just doesn't make any sense, and it's only for a brief section of the hotel as well. They don't show up in Remake, but coincidentally that game does the opposite, where a regular enemy becomes a boss, and I don't like what they've done here either. After finding another princess piece in this room, a Mandarin smashes through it and is now a boss fight. It was interesting to see that fighting them above the cage was trivial, albeit annoying in the labyrinth when you have to keep running past them, but they're actually pretty savage when fighting them on the same elevation. The issue with this boss fight is thematically I don't think it mixes in with the hotel at all. Consider the symbolism of their design and what the cages they hang from signify. A part of their identity has been removed with nothing to gain. I'm aware that these enemies appear in the original's hotel as well, but in that game they're still under cages, so their identity isn't lost, while here the enemy just comes off as some big monster to kill, and the fight isn't even that good either from a gameplay perspective. Remake very rarely goes out of its way to change things up for the worst, so even though I don't like some aspects of it in general, they're few and far between, which I think is a good testament overall to the quality of the game. This room soon after the boss looks like someone has been butchered, as there's blood all over the walls, but then you find the red paint can, and I honestly kind of love it when games and media subvert expectations like this. Someone in here went through all the trouble and effort of making it appear as a murder scene, which begs the question of why they would even do this in the first place. So we combine the paint with the light bulb and put it into the vanity mirror where the words "deed done" appear. So perhaps then it's a ghostly reference to something that's happened in this room in the past. Gaining access to the employee elevator, we can now go to the staff only first floor, and this next sequence is surprising because it's kind of a stealth sequence. You have to unequip everything as the lift can only support so much weight. While both games have this section, Remakes plays out more of a stealth sequence than the originals. You have to avoid the Mandarins patrolling the halls, but the original has you basically running past mannequins to avoid dying. The whole purpose of this section is to get a videotape, but before we go, we can find an interesting heater here named Johnny. I thought I'd just mention that. When we head back into the hotel lobby, it now appears torn down and damp. Solving the Princess music box, we now get the key to go upstairs and room 312 awaits us. This is where everything about the game's story is about to get turned on its head. The entire game has been leading up to this moment, so let's put the tape in and watch the cutscene play out.
Are you taping again? Come on. I don't know why, but I just love it here. It's so peaceful. You know what I heard? This whole area used to be a sacred place. I think I can see why. It's too bad we have to leave. Promise you'll take me again, James.
It's a shocking moment. It turns out that it was James who killed his wife the entire time, and the look of shame on his face as it's reflected back in the television is telling as he sits in his own thoughts. The amnesia James had before coming to the town is now erased, and he's fully aware of everything. He knows what he's done is completely abhorrent, and it's weighing down on him heavily. This revelation changes how we perceive James as a character, as well as the story up to this point. It begins to make sense why throughout the game we had particular negative reactions from characters or messages on walls directed at James. This was all foreshadowed right from the very beginning. Here's some examples that I spotted. The public bathroom, when he looks at his hands, is similar to the way he looks at his hands after killing Eddie, because he had killed Mary not long before arriving in Silent Hill. Laura telling James he didn't love Mary out of nowhere. Maria asking him if he loved Mary, which again is a strange thing to ask out of nowhere. The Morse code with the first TV in the apartment spells out, "Why did you do it, James?" Eddie telling James that they're both the same and he too was summoned to the town for a reason. The message on the wall in Neely's bar, along with the note in the Otherworld town telling us if we want the truth then to keep marching on. The camera framing James as hanging himself when we have to pull the noose in the prison because he's a murderer. Angela accusing James of not wanting Mary to be around out of nowhere. James's grave appearing alongside the other characters because they're all guilty of doing something bad. The Otherworlds having a sheet placed over everything, which can now be deduced as a reference to smothering. And my favourite one, although it's hard to make out, the inventory screen this entire time has actually been playing a distorted scene of James killing Mary from the original game's videotape scene. The original game shares many of these hints, but it does have two unique hints of its own. The first, while technically being in the beta version of the game, is when you first get the radio, Mary straight up asks James why did he kill her. This was altered into the final version, as it obviously spoils the entire twist of the game. The other hint is after you leave the hospital, James insinuates that Mary could be somehow punishing him, which now makes sense after you learn the truth. There are likely other hints I've missed out on, but I really think they were all done well enough and thoughtful too, without being too on the nose. Certainly some of them would make you question why, like, the Neely's Bar wall message was there in the first place, but never was the foreshadowing to the point where it was obvious. You could maybe argue there is one too many hints overall though, and I'm sure some of you figured it out before the reveal. Laura enters the room asking if he's found Mary yet, and he reveals to her that it was him who killed her. Her reaction is sad, and while Mary was always going to die from the disease, there was maybe some hope from Mary herself that it would have worked out fine in the end, with her adopting Laura. In that sense then, Laura has not only lost a friend, but potentially a mother too, so her reaction of sadness and anger is justified. This entire scene and the voice acting in the remake is honestly done so well. I was kind of taken aback by the raw emotion you can feel throughout it, and it made me realise how far games have actually come in terms of storytelling and cinematics. The original scene is done well too, and mostly matches up with the remake. Laura walks out feeling let down with James instead of running out full of emotion as in the remake. I felt both reactions Laura has between the two versions are justified, despite being different. We don't actually see Laura again after she leaves the room, with the exception of one of the endings. James sits on the couch for a while deep in his thoughts and gets a message once again from Mary on the radio to go find her. The hotel has now been transformed into a completely broken down, burnt looking state with leaks of water all over the place. In yet another twist, the entire time we've been in the hotel has actually been the Otherworld version all along, despite appearing as the Fog World. Before the story of the game, the hotel was burnt down in an accident, and there are hints towards this. One of the paintings in a prison cell shows the hotel on fire. Johnny the heater in the hotel first floor was presumably the actual cause, and the misty fog I mentioned earlier could also be a hint, as that tends to form after cold water hits a hot surface. There are otherworld enemies throughout the hotel as well, and the unusual cleanliness of it, as though it was being maintained by staff, is unlike the other locations, which did feel abandoned completely. The hotel felt off right from the get-go, but now we know why. Unfortunately, one incredibly stupid thing I noticed is if you're playing on the PlayStation 5, the activity card system actually spoils the twist from the very beginning of the hotel section, and I honestly cannot believe it wasn't found and removed, even to this day. The entire point of this twist is the fact that it contrasts with the other world we see throughout the game, and so for it to be spoiled like this is pretty stupid. All that being said though, the question of course is, why does the hotel in the other world appear in such a serene state when the other parts of the town were not? The hotel is the special place Mary was talking about all along, so it has a significant meaning for James, and it's likely he didn't know the hotel was burnt down after his visit. So the town conjures up an idealisation version of the hotel for him, as that's how he would have remembered it. As we work our way out of the hotel, we come across a recording from someone who sounds like the hospital director, and he's talking about a female patient's condition not being curable.
I'm no longer sure if it was of any use, if it meant anything at all. I can't say if this newfound understanding, if there's any wisdom to be had in all that happened. I suppose that's for you to learn, and I hope you will.
He wonders if the pain was worth it and if it meant anything, or if there was any wisdom in what has happened. But it's for someone to learn from all of it. This recording replaces another in the original where the doctor is actually in the room discussing with James about Mary's condition, and James is distraught at the news that she can't be cured. He still cared about her at this point, in other words. It's not clear who the doctor is talking to in the new recording, but my feeling when I listened to it was he's talking to the player and is not only talking about Mary, but also Eddie and Angela, because he says they at one point in the recording. So it's almost as if the game is asking the player directly what they've learned. That was the impression I got. While the overall progression through the Fogworld Hotel is mostly linear, an interesting gimmick can be found only in the original game. In the second floor after the videotape scene, some doors act as portals to other doors on that same hallway, and you have to figure out which door combinations is the correct one. It's probably a sign that James's mind is becoming completely fragmented at this point. I think there was a missed opportunity with Remake here because I would have loved to seen this work in this version, Portal style. It's likely it didn't make the cut because of the way Remake deals with doors in general. There's no loading screens, and so the developers would have had to program a way to render both the current hallway twice as well as the player model, which probably wasn't worth the headache. Entering the basement, we find a door with an orange light piercing through it, and inside we find a staircase on fire. Angela is standing inside and she mistakes James for her mother, which I found strange. Maybe the town has a way of making people hallucinate things. She thanks James for helping her earlier but wishes he hadn't because her mother said she deserves what happened to her when she was a child. This line confused me because she's been looking for her mother the whole time, so it seems like the only person in the world she seems to care about also happens to hate her. James says the room is hot as hell, which seems obvious, but Angela asks him if he sees the flames too and how it's always like this for her. So we're seeing some of Angela's other world here, and this may explain why after the videotape there's an orange light piercing through the hotel windows. Although you could argue it's also because the hotel itself burnt down too and is now showing its own reality. There is one thing I don't understand about Angela's story. We know the town summons people to it who are guilty of doing terrible things, so why then was she summoned to it if she was the victim? She killed her father and brother, but we're not told if Angela killed in self-defense. Based on the fact she was summoned to the town, I would have to assume it wasn't. She likely feels some guilt, however small, over killing them, and this is probably why the town would summon her at all, as it seems to feed off the negative emotions of these characters regardless. The game's community speculates that she could have been looking for her mother so she can kill her as well for not defending her when she was a child. The town likely knows the character's intentions and so deemed Angela worthy of being summoned to it for this reason alone if it's true. Angela walks up the stairs and into the fire where we don't see her again in the game. She's ended her life. Heading back out the door, we come across some enemies and they're all beginning to die, just as James's delusion is too. The enemies no longer have any reason to exist, and so their job is done. The room before this next scene has the infamous save point with 9 red pages instead of the usual 1. It's one of the more contentious discussions in the Silent Hill community on what this signifies, and I'm convinced that they do symbolise something as well. They're even on the box art of the game in Japan, as well as being the loading icon for the remake. One speculation is that they represent the 9 enemies we meet throughout the game, and a deleted tweet from Masahiro Ito kind of confirmed this theory, and the addition of the spider mannequin helps support it as well. Unlike the other save points, James doesn't look at this one. We know it's to do with his mind because with the first save point he comments that something is groping around in his skull, so perhaps then these final 9 squares and him not looking at them is his refusal to accept the truth of what he's done. They also serve as a warning for the player to save, as there is no turning back from this point on. James enters this room to find Maria once again alive, but this time she is trapped between 2 pyramid heads and is now in a torture device.
Leave her alone! Leave us both the hell alone!
She's killed for the 3rd time, and it's at this point that James finally realises what the Pyramid Head has been trying to do to him throughout the game. The Pyramid Head represents James's guilt and desire to be punished for what he's done to Mary. This is why it shows up to kill Maria over and over again, to try to make James snap out of his repressed memory. The Jacob's Ladder quote from earlier on should now make more sense. It's not clear why there are 2 of them in the scene, however. Maybe one was for killing Mary and the other for killing Eddie, which seems to be the commentary in the community. There were 2 pyramid heads on the gallows wall in the prison, and after killing each one in this fight you get an egg from each of them. One is rusted and the other is new, which perhaps references James's old psyche and his newfound one after watching the tape. After defeating both of them in combat, and because James is now awakened, the Pyramid Head's objective is done and they both brutally kill themselves. The difference between remake and original in this scene is a little different because of how James reacts between both games. The remake gives the impression he is more fatigued because of his journey up to this point, but in the original there is much more anger and visible emotion in his demeanour. I think the voice acting is not the greatest in the original here, but I do prefer its cutscene direction more than remakes, simply because James has been more emotionally manipulated throughout the game, and so it makes sense he's fed up rather than worn out. One thing I do like in the remake is the blood running down Maria's face, which gives the scene a more brutal atmosphere. But James still has one more confrontation left. We go into a long hallway and hear a flashback of Mary speaking to James. It gives us a glimpse into their relationship towards the end, where she was treating James pretty badly because of her frustrations with the disease, which is understandable from her perspective, but it could also explain why James did eventually snap and kill her. Like Angela, James now has to ascend his own stairs and face his demons. We reach the top to find Mary looking out a window, and as James embraces her, he feels something is wrong and then realises it's not Mary but Maria masquerading. James at this point is tired of her manipulation and once again refuses her advances. Maria doesn't accept this and we now have to fight her. If it wasn't obvious after her first death and then her second reappearance, it should be by now. Maria, just like all of the enemies and bosses, is just another manifestation created by James. Maria represents what James wanted Mary to be in both appearance and behaviour. She's also the town's way of emotionally harming James, whether it's seducing him, making remarks about his wife which are insensitive, or how she even behaves when she has to take the pills in the hospital and lie down, which only just reminds James more of his wife as she was dying in the hospital. When Pyramid Head kills Maria repeatedly, that's meant to obviously hurt James mentally in a way that constantly reminds him of Mary's death. I mentioned earlier about how she kind of has an evil look to her. I can't say if it's because of the outdated CG in the original game, but her eyes always gave off an unsettling appearance, and in remake her whole demeanour just comes off as strange and wicked. In other words, possible hints that she was inherently evil. Although she's a manifestation, it always felt like she had some kind of independence too, unlike the monsters roaming around. Whether it's staying in the hospital room to sleep or help James look for Laura outside the theatre. In other words, she doesn't need to have James around in order to exist, and in fact, in the original game, there's an extra mode called Born from a Wish, where you actually play as Maria before James even arrives in the town. Another character you meet in this mode even warns her about James too. I can only speculate that the town had Maria prepared for James because it knew he would arrive into it eventually, so having Maria become her own self for a while would have helped pass her off as a real person. There's even official artwork that shows Maria and Laura talking to each other on the wall, and in the game's posters advertising with Heaven's Night, it has Maria or someone who looks like Maria on them as well. She's basically a pawn for the town to do its bidding whether she knows it or not. The design of the final boss is very similar to Flesh Lips and is a bit disappointing if I'm honest. I didn't expect a big grotesque monster or anything, that's not this game's style. But this is too similar to Flesh Lips and even has a second and third phase similar to that boss as well. It just feels too safe for a final boss in a game that has had so many interesting designs throughout. The use of moths in this battle is interesting as we've seen them before in the room in Woodside. And Maria also has a butterfly tattoo as well. I'm not going to go too Silence of the Lambs here, but of course the moth could obviously signify some sort of rebirth or change, and that's pretty much what we're seeing in this battle. It's Maria's true and final form. We finally put Maria out of her misery, and depending on what parameters you've met throughout the game will also determine what ending you get as well. But this brings us to the end of this story segment of the review. If you want to hear my thoughts on the ending cutscene and credits, then skip now to the conclusion part of this video, which I should have timestamped. There will also be a special section of the review dedicated to a theory that has divided the community just before the conclusion segment, which will also be timestamped. For now, Silent Hill 2 and its story isn't the whole experience. Mechanically and visually things have changed vastly from the original, so it's time to look over those aspects before we see the ending of the game. With over 2 decades between remake and original, the gameplay of Silent Hill 2 Remake has also had to undergo an evolution, just like the portrayal of the story. The switch from the original game's dynamic and mixed camera angles is pretty dramatic, and it means that some elements of the gameplay have had to be completely redesigned. At the beginning of the game you'll find a radio that will help alert you to enemies nearby, but it can also trigger when these bugs are in the same area, making you second guess if it's a real enemy nearby or not. The original game also has these bugs, but they make a more unique ringing sound. So it's obvious it's not a proper enemy in that game. The original game has really simple combat, as was common with survival horror games at the time, but in Silent Hill 2 it's perhaps more simpler than it should have been, and that's mainly down to how easy it is to just unlock enemies. You can simply run up to one in the original, and as long as you've struck first with a melee weapon and held down the attack button, they pretty much can't retaliate. The guns are similar to how they work in most survival horror games. You point the gun and the game generally does the targeting for you. It's the same thing here in Silent Hill 2, but the enemies also get stun locked with each hit from the gun. There's no real strategy to the combat at all in the original game. The original game also has a habit of having enemies ambush you when you're loading into new rooms, which can come off as cheap at times. On one hand, this can create tension as it makes you second guess what's behind each door, which is good in a survival horror game. But on the other hand, while I only played on normal difficulty for this version, if hard mode is anything like remakes, I can see myself becoming frustrated with some of the enemy placements behind the load screens in the original game. The melee combat in Remake has been overhauled, and no longer can you hit stun them the way you could in the original, so each combat encounter now feels more meaningful, with the player now having to be more alert. James can also now dodge enemy attacks, and the flow of the combat is not far off something like the Souls games. Enemies themselves can now dodge your attacks as well, and counter them by grabbing your weapon or dodging it to follow up with their own quick attack. They can also now grab onto James himself if you're not paying attention. They're more versatile overall in Remake, and this makes the encounters more engaging. The melee is more visceral too, thanks to the modern graphics and sounds, especially when James is screaming in anger as you hit the enemies. It makes the melee feel more impactful overall compared to the original. It's not perfect, however. I had two issues with the melee combat. One is sometimes as you attack, it's obvious that James is simply magnetising to the closest enemy. That in itself isn't an issue and is logical for melee combat in a third person game. But sometimes the range at which this happens is much longer than it should be. If there was more than one enemy and they were near each other, quite often I'd get magnetised to the wrong one, creating some frustrating situations. The enemies had similar issues. I tried to dodge their attack, but they'd magnetise to me instead from distances I felt were further than they should be. This was most obvious with the mannequins when you tried to do a back dodge. The second issue lies with the camera. I felt like it could do with a lock-on system of some sort. I've had times where I would either target the wrong enemy because I wasn't facing it dead on, not target them at all for whatever reason, or the camera would just screw me over because I was backed into a wall or in a narrow hallway where the camera itself doesn't have much room to manoeuvre. A solution could be allowing the camera's collision to exit past the environment and then block out any out-of-bound graphics. Super Mario Sunshine on the GameCube does something very similar to this, and it works fine in that game. The downside would be a hit to the presentation, and for an immersive game like Silent Hill 2, it might not be acceptable. So as things are now, I was battling the camera a bit too much throughout the game. I'm honestly surprised the developers didn't find a way to alleviate these problems, because they happen frequently enough that it can spoil some combat encounters. When you combine this with the more intense melee combat on the harder difficulties, it can get very annoying when the camera does something you don't expect. I'm sure the developers themselves aren't happy with it either, and hopefully some solutions can be found for future games. But on a more positive note with the camera, you can now aim your gun at different body parts of the enemies, such as their legs, which can stun them, allowing you to rush in for a melee kill. You can knock them down if you manage to shoot out both legs quick enough, and headshots seem to do more damage in general as well, so there's more nuance to the gunplay in Remake compared to the originals. The guns aren't a simple point and click either. As you're aiming, the reticule will move slightly, making headshots difficult enough. It does become more accurate if you let it rest for a few seconds, but that's something I found hard to do because the enemies don't wait around to confront you. They'll walk towards you as soon as they've become alert to your presence. It's reminiscent of the recent Resident Evil remakes if you've played those games, but it's more harsher in terms of accuracy, I found. One thing that surprised me is the lack of ammo and health. I played the game on hard combat difficulty, and this mode compared to normal might as well be a different game. There were a few situations where I had no ammo or health and had to fight my way through enemies with just melee. The contrast with normal difficulty is really significant in Remake. On a second playthrough on normal, the amount of health items you get was over the top too. You could easily half the amount given and still have a generous amount left over. I didn't die once on this difficulty either, and never really felt like I was in much danger simply because I could get my health back to full anytime I wanted. There should have been a difficulty in between normal and hard, as both of them are extremes in the opposite directions. Some games like the newer Resident Evils will usually give you ammo or health if it knows you're low on them when you break objects or open drawers. But this dynamic difficulty doesn't seem to be in Silent Hill 2, and I think I actually prefer it this way despite my concerns, as it forces the player to adapt around the game's mechanics and situations, rather than the game adapting to the player instead. One advantage the original game has over Remake is James will look directly at ammo or health, making it easier to spot them, whereas in Remake, because of the new perspective, it's easier to miss said items despite having total freedom over where you're looking. An annoying thing in the Remake with items was opening containers or drawers to find them. Most of the time these were empty for me, and the animation started to feel like a waste of time after a while. This doesn't seem to be a problem on the normal difficulty, so it's really just something you'll find on the harder difficulty. All that said, the combat in the original game really wasn't good, and while it wasn't the focus point, the game does throw a decent amount of enemies at you, so I felt like it should have been better even for its time. All in all, the remake's combat is a definite improvement over the originals. It's more visceral, it's mechanically more varied, and on hard mode, it's difficult and stressful, which enhances the atmosphere. Having both the story and gameplay as a stressful experience for me is the best way to play these kind of horror games. As you explore the game, you'll find yourself having to solve puzzles. Some of these range from simply finding missing clock hands and figuring out what the correct time is on the clock itself, to finding 3 coins and putting them in their correct slots. Sometimes it's gathering various items and combining them to form new ones, which then allow you to solve certain puzzles. The puzzles aren't super complex in Silent Hill 2, but I've always enjoyed trying to figure them out, more so than say the combat. An interesting thing the remake and original do is let you change the puzzle difficulties. If you choose the easier difficulties, you're given less of a full puzzle, whether it's less pieces to fit into a slot or smaller numbers to remember. I think it's cool that you can change the combat and puzzle difficulties independently of each other, and there's even a randomization to some puzzles which forces the player to figure them out by themselves. I'm a fan of this because it does become too easy nowadays to get stumped by a puzzle and then simply find the solution online. You can still do that here, but you'll have to be the one to piece the numbers together, since it's those that are usually randomised. I have to admit though, I'm guilty of being too impatient with puzzles in other games before just finding the hint or answer online. But with this game I really decided to dig my teeth in and see if I can actually just solve these things without any help, and I found that for the most puzzles you should be able to. You just have to sometimes take them at their literal word and not overthink them, such as with the coin puzzle in the apartment, which seems deeper than it actually is. The way the puzzles work in Remake is mechanically far more seamless than the original too. For example, the coin puzzle in the original game is tedious to deal with because you have to go to the menu, put the coins in one by one, and if you screw up the solution you have to one by one take all of the coins out and start again. It's really tedious if you get it wrong. Remake on the other hand just lets you put all the coins in and switch them around without having to exit the puzzle's interface. I get why they likely had to do it that way in the original, as they may have required a more detailed model for the puzzle box, but I highly doubt the developers themselves were happy with this, as looking at videos it seems like they improved puzzle solving for the third game, at least partially. Many puzzles have now been moved around. For example, the grandfather clock now appears in Blue Creek instead of the Woodside apartment, and the hospital lockbox is now located in the second floor lobby of the Otherworld rather than a random patient's room in the original. What used to be just another puzzle to solve in the original game is now the center point puzzle to figure out in order to proceed past that location in Remake's story. Some areas have added new puzzles altogether, and areas like the prison outdoor gallows have been completely changed in Remake, and now require you to get the weights throughout the prison in order to open new sections of the map not previously seen in the original game. No longer do you have to keep running in and out of 2 rooms with loading times just to see if you got the correct answer for the Hanging Man puzzle, because Remake now combines this puzzle with another and puts them into the same location. So in all, they've streamlined the user interface for puzzles, they've changed the locations of some of them for the better, and combined others into a larger puzzle to solve along with brand new ones to figure out as well. I never felt any of these were for the worst, and I can say that solving puzzles in Remake was more fun compared to the original, if only because of the user interface improvements alone. Now to talk about the game's location and how Remake expanded on it. The game takes place in the mid-80s to early 90s, and you can tell by looking at the design of cars and various newspapers or calendars on walls. It's not exact what time it takes place in, as these newspapers and calendars have strangely different dates on them, but the range seems accurate. I think it's great that the developers kept this time period in for the remake, because it does lend a certain atmosphere to the setting when you see how dated the technology and architecture is. In a way, it helps with the abandoned feel of the game for us as the player. Speaking of the setting, the game seems to be set in Maine, New England, while other people say it's set in Pennsylvania. There seems to be a debate in the community on which it is, so I looked into it, and it seems that the movie is based on a town in Pennsylvania, but the games are based in Maine. You can even find Maine newspapers in Remake, so there isn't an exact town that they base it on. And this is probably a good idea, as it allows the developers the freedom to design the town how they want. Silent Hill 4 and the newly announced Silent Hill F don't even take place in Silent Hill, which indicates that the curse can now follow characters beyond the town itself. At the end of some roads, you can come to blocked areas with a tarp covering scaffolding. There's also sinkholes that seem to have infinite depth to them, like a black void you'd see in the other world. As mentioned in the story segment, the tarp covering is probably from James either remembering the bedsheets from Mary's sickbed or a reference to him smothering her. It's used here now to simply divert the player elsewhere. All of the areas from the original game return, and layout wise they're mostly similar. If you found it easy to navigate the original game's map, then you should feel at home in Remake. There are, however, many expanded areas in the game, and these are usually in main locations such as the apartments, the hospital, the prison, and so on. But the town itself has a few new areas to explore, like shops and small sections of Saul Street and its apartment. Some of them are optional, but others require you to find items in them in order to proceed. While all of these expansions and changes to the puzzles are great, they have also resulted in a longer playtime. Remake for me was over twice as long to complete versus the original, and granted I was playing on a harder difficulty compared to that game, but it was honestly shocking to go back to the PS2 game and be at Heaven's Night at hour 3, whereas in Remake I might have just been halfway through Woodside Apartments. I didn't really mind the extra length of the game, but to be fair, I do play games slowly anyway, as I want to search for every nook and cranny it has to offer. I reckon a regular playthrough of Remake should be 8 hours or so, which is still noticeably longer than the original. One other potential downside to these expansions is it meant more enemies to fight, and I was feeling a bit fatigued towards the end of the game from it. I also believe the more sophisticated combat and AI were part of that reason too. In the original you could obviously just mindlessly kill enemies for the most part, but in Remake not so much. You have to be alert more often in this game. But overall, I found many of these expansions and changes to be good. The new buildings you can enter never detracted from the experience and usually helped to flesh the town out a bit more, while also giving it a more lived-in feeling. I want to briefly mention the game's options and the amount of customization that can be had with it. The usual suspects are there, like camera sensitivity and performance modes, but what really impressed me is the options given to people who have hearing or vision difficulties. There is even a contrast mode that can highlight characters, enemies and items in the environment, as well as different colours for those highlighted models. Aspects of the subtitles can be changed, like the size and text background opacity. The radio static itself can now be displayed on screen. You can even adjust the size of the aim reticule, the interaction button, and change its appearance if it's not visible enough. Even for people with no disabilities, there is a good few options here to make the game experience more to your tastes, whether it's making the game harder by turning off the ammo counter or more immersive by disabling most of the heads up display. If there's one visual element I'm grateful they allow you to turn off, it's the low health vignette. This awful effect stays with you even out of combat and makes exploring visually annoying, if not downright impossible, at least for me. I can honestly say that turning it off vastly improved the experience, and if I wasn't sure about my exact health condition, I just looked at the PS5 controller anyway, which tells you your health condition via the light bar. There's a sizable list of options here, and while I know many games are becoming more inclusive of people with disabilities, it's great to see when a developer goes a step beyond. With a new over-the-shoulder camera system comes new mechanical behaviours for the enemies, with some of them being more vast than others. I mentioned earlier about how enemies were easy to kill in the original game, and while they were aesthetically fantastic designs for a horror game, mechanically they didn't enhance the horror itself that much simply because the player could stun lock them. Remake fixes these problems. This isn't to say you can't just run past them or exploit their behaviours, but each engagement now requires you to carefully think out how you're going to fight the enemy, or whether you should even fight them depending on your health or ammo situation. While the basic behaviour is similar between Remake and Original in terms of the enemy attacks, there have been improvements and new behaviours introduced to most enemies. The combat against most enemies works similar to the previously mentioned Souls games in terms of one-on-ones. With the line figure, you have to carefully dodge its acid spit and headbutts. They can now grab onto unsuspecting players when they're crawling around, which can be anxiety inducing when you barely have any health. The bubblehead nurses are similar in terms of how you fight them, but they have better range on their melee attacks and they can counter-attack the player if they go for too many consecutive hits. The biggest upgrade any enemy got by far has to go to the mannequin. Because of the new camera perspective, these enemies no longer have to hide in plain sight like in the original game, and can now hide among things like furniture, behind walls and other objects. When you first go into a room, if you're quick enough you can even sometimes see them walking towards a better hiding spot. The way they try to mask their profile within the environment impressed me as well, because while it is possible to spot them hiding before they can ambush you, there are many times where they are hiding in plain sight and can be hard to discern from the environment itself. A new variant called the Spider Mannequin will hide in the ceiling and walls and attack unsuspecting players from above, but for the most part they're usually just crawling along the walls and can easily be ignored, which is a bit of a disappointment, but still. Because of their new behaviour in Remake, I was usually on edge when walking into rooms thinking there might be one hiding somewhere, and that's pretty amazing to me that one enemy can psychologically affect the player's behaviour in such a way for almost the rest of the game. That being said, once you do fight them, they behave similarly to the previous enemies, but maybe a bit more aggressive, and once you figure out how they're hiding, they do become a bit predictable with a few exceptions. In the hotel, there is a room full of actual mannequins, and the game pulled a bit of a reverse psychology on me, as one doesn't show up until the far end of the room. The original does something interesting I should note while I'm here. When you reload an area, the mannequin will change its limb positioning, which is subtle but a really nice touch. I can't think of an enemy from any other remake that has been given such an overhaul and have it work out brilliantly in the end. Definitely a star of the show if you play this game. The weakest enemy in the game has to be the Mandarins. They are slow, they very audibly alert the player to their presence, and you can easily just run past them. This goes for both versions of the game too. It should have been an enemy Remake improved better. I'd say maybe have them shake the cages underneath James or shoot out an asset similar to the line figure, so he can't just simply run past them. But if you do decide to stay and fight them, then you basically just have to shoot the tip of both arms until they let go of the cage. It's easier in Remake since you can just aim exactly where you want to, but in the original it can be finicky due to the outdated aiming mechanics, so in that game I just run past them. You can also knock enemies down in one hit if you sneak up on them with the flashlight turned off. However, I found this to rarely work for me for whatever reason, but it's a neat little feature either way, some sort of stealth mechanic the game has. Some bosses in the remake are also mechanically expanded on compared to the original. In that game you're usually locked into a small room where you have to run to one end, shoot the boss and then run to the other, rinse and repeat. It's not very interesting in terms of gameplay overall. Remake usually expands on them by giving them new phases, a bigger arena to fight in, and while you're still running back and forward to increase the distance between yourself and the boss, They can now catch up to you fairly easily and force you into situations where you're having to dodge their attacks. Some bosses did get more of an overhaul compared to others, such as the Flesh Lip, where you have to keep an eye on its position in the ceiling, along with its new phases on the ground. Or the Abstract Daddy boss, where you're running away from it through hallways until you finally battle it one-on-one. Some other bosses, however, didn't get as much of a treatment, such as the Pyramid Head fights being very similar to their original counterpart, or the thematically out of place Mandarin fight ended up being uninteresting overall. I was also disappointed with how similar the final boss fight was mechanically to Flesh Lips. The phases are even similar, and if you're out of health when entering the battle, picking up the health items the game arena gives you showcases another issue with Remake that I didn't foresee until fighting this boss. When James picks up items, he does an animation for doing so, and unfortunately when you have a boss as aggressive as the final one in the game, his animation caused me to die or get hit quite often in this fight, just simply because of how slow it was. I should mention that the original doesn't suffer from this issue, as picking up items is fast in that game. The simple solution to this is to have James pick up items faster when he's engaged in combat, or if the player is mashing the button to pick the item up. Once again, playing on the hard difficulty exacerbated this issue, so you may not have the same problem I had if you're playing on normal or easy, but it was really frustrating fighting the final boss this way. Overall, I understand the developers perhaps didn't want to rock the boat in terms of changing up most enemies and bosses in a significant way, and admittedly the game isn't really about the combat anyway, but I can't help but wonder what if most enemies and bosses got the treatment the mannequin got. But that's the gameplay of Silent Hill 2 Remake. While it has particular flaws, I found it to be a vast improvement compared to the original. Gunplay is more mechanically satisfying, puzzles are easier to solve thanks to better user interfaces, the enemies are more dangerous and varied in their attacks, the expanded locations added to the game, and the new camera allows for a more overall immersive experience. But having a new camera doesn't automatically mean that it has a more immersive experience automatically. It needs to go hand in hand with the graphics and presentation, which we're now going to take a look at. I mentioned in the story segment about how far we've come in voice acting and storytelling for games, but the same can be said for the graphics. The original game was no slouch in terms of its visuals, especially for 2001 when it was part of the PS2's first 12 months on the market. So the remake has to live up to not only the original in terms of pushing graphics, but also other contemporary games as well. Using Unreal Engine 5 and the plethora of options it gives game developers, such as Lumen, which is similar to ray trace lighting, as well as Nanite with its virtualized geometry, Silent Hill 2 Remake is one of the best looking games I've played in some time. The fog is obviously an integral part of the franchise, and the town would not be as iconic without it, so it's important to get it right for a remake. But first I want to talk briefly about the original game's fog. It goes for a more windy and violent look, and feels more oppressive to the player. When you combine this with the dynamic camera and noise filter, it was really easy to get lost in this version of the game. The fog effect in the original was created to mask the extremely low draw distance, with the benefit of also being an artistic choice at the same time. This allowed them to really push other aspects of the graphics, such as the poly counts on models and other more finer micro details. I still think the fog looks good even today, and I've read that the PS2 had particularly high fill rates compared to the Xbox or GameCube. My understanding is this allows the system to easily do fog effects and transparencies compared to the other consoles, despite being weaker overall in comparison to them. The fog in the remake is done differently. It goes for a more volumetric and calm appearance. While it still likely helps in reducing graphics load on the GPU, the fog in remake strikes me as the developers being able to focus more on its appearance than mostly using it to mask draw distance. You can actually see how much more vast the draw distance is in the remake if you use a mod on the PC version to remove the fog. The fog's radius is further away from the player in remake, and as such it's easier to see more ahead of you, but not to the point where it feels like it ruins the intent and atmosphere of the game. I think they could have decreased the radius just a bit though, to make it feel more claustrophobic like the original. Some rare moments in the remake has the weather becoming windy and violent, and it looks fantastic. It creates situations that felt tense as it became harder to see and hear the enemies. It makes me wonder if these moments were meant to be callbacks to the original game's more violent fog. There is one particular area I really liked when it came to the fog's appearance. In the Woodside apartments, there's a courtyard separating each block of buildings, and the fog here isn't as dense as in the streets, which makes sense, but you can actually see it being separated from the top and bottom of the courtyard, as well as sticking to the walls. It looks impressive, and the developers could have easily just reused the town fog, but I like the effort that's gone into changing the fog's appearance throughout the game. In areas near water, the fog can look misty, for example, so the developers didn't just throw the fog together and then mindlessly reuse it throughout the game. They understood that there would have to be areas where it would have to look different. I do have one complaint, however, about the fog in Remake. It's not a big deal, but the ray tracing doesn't reflect the fog at all on the ground surfaces, and while I understand this may have carried a huge penalty to the performance, I feel like it should have been optimised better to try capture it somehow, considering that the fog is so prominent in terms of the art. All that being said though, I think the fog in Remake looks good despite going for a different appearance. The new over-the-shoulder perspective gives Remake a unique look into the game's iconic setting, which for many people is the entire reason to buy a remake in the first place. It allows the player more freedom to view the town from their perspective, which is a fairly major difference compared to the original. In the original, the developers had more control over what the player saw and how a scene could be set up a particular way with that camera system in mind. Many classical survival horror games that used pre-rendered backgrounds were known for doing this, and it was a great benefit to those games for the same reasons. The big downside obviously being restrictions on where the player can move or what they can see. For Silent Hill 2, some scenes are superior in one version but not the other. One example I found superior in the original is when you find the torchlight. The camera angle here is specific and shows off the shadowing the engine can cast. At first it looks like there's a headless body in the middle of a room until you get closer and realise it's just the clothes mannequin. But these few seconds of figuring out what we're looking at in the original aren't exactly there in Remake, because we can already see the light emanating from the room before we even enter it, and so our attention is already on the torchlight from the get-go. The torchlight is also much more intense in Remake, and I felt inclined to grab it faster before I got a headache or something. Remake does have an advantage in this scene though. The freedom of camera control can give a false impression of safety and control, so when the mannequin shows up, it can be much more shocking than in the original. The remake's advantages over the original is in more scenic open locations, such as the town itself, or introductions to places like the apartments, the hospital or the hotel. Areas like the Otherworld now let you look up and see the sky as an endless black void, or the blood reaching up to the ceiling in the labyrinth hallway. They both have their advantages. One is more controlled and specific to what the director of the game intended, while the other is a perspective that each individual player may or may not see. Going away from the camera, one aspect of the remake that really impressed me was the lighting. There is an intricacy to the way the light bounces around the environment thanks to the global illumination, and it can give each location a particular look or feel thanks to the light bounce. This might not be to every Silent Hill fan's taste, but Remake can really look colourful at times because of this real-time lighting. An example being the Heavens nightclub, which looks really impressive. When it comes to the Otherworld sections of the game, the rustic metals mixed with the bounce lighting creates this orange atmosphere that feels toxic to even breathe in. And when it gets dark in the Otherworld, the game doesn't pull any punches, it really does get dark, and it's the total contrast to the fog world. Speaking of lighting, the flashlight in the original game actually casts real-time dynamic shadows depending on which part of the environment is being lit up, like the furniture or enemies. I found myself honestly surprised at how good this still looked when I replayed the game. In certain areas the camera becomes fixed in the original game, so you can get far enough away from it and see the flashlight still working in the distance, which looks cool from different angles and is honestly impressive. It obviously serves more than an aesthetic purpose. Its job is to help the player see what's ahead, and it's pretty interesting to see the likes of mannequins just come into view as you get close to them in the apartment hallways. It feels like the flashlight has an intricate depth to it, which you wouldn't expect in a 2001 PS2 game. A downside I did notice though is the shadowing from characters or monsters is of a low poly model, which can look distracting when playing the game at a higher than intended resolutions. I totally understand why they had to do this. The hardware would have needed to draw 2 high quality models rather than 1 in order to look more accurate. I'm not complaining either way, and it's something that can be fixed in an actual remaster of the game. For a remake's flashlight, it does the job well here too, and can cast shadows on nearly everything you can think of. Modern games have gotten so good at this kind of thing that they can draw multiple high quality shadow models and do more accurate calculations and approximations at the same time. Not soon after the original game's release, the likes of Half-Life 2 or Doom 3 pushed it up a notch, along with other modern titles as time went on. All of this is to say, the flashlight looks fine in Remake, but it isn't pushing boundaries, and it would have been nice for it to have light bounce. Understandably, this would have been beyond the current console's ray tracing performance, but it does seem like it's the next step for this kind of player-controlled, dynamic lighting that we'll see in the next generation perhaps. The geometry and texture work used in the game is pretty impressive, and I don't think I've seen a game with such good macro detail since the VR game Half-Life Alyx, which kind of required it since players would be bringing objects up to their face to get a closer look. This is obviously not required in a third-person game, but the developers still went to the trouble of putting this kind of detail into smaller objects throughout it. You can go right up to the phone booths, car park tills and newspaper stands, and all of the textures and details hold up incredibly well. You can actually read some of this stuff you wouldn't expect to be able to, and some of it is actually lore related too, which is a bonus. Having good texture work also goes hand in hand with modern game rendering because of the properties each one has to have in order to accurately portray the material, whether it's metal being able to reflect light, or the lighting passing through human skin with what's called subsurface scattering, which you can easily notice on the player's ears when sunlight is shining directly at them. Another technical aspect of the textures is the parallax mapping, which gives textures various amounts of depth. It's noticeable on the brick walls or the impressive gravel in the hotel garden. This technique has been around for a long time, but it still impresses me whenever I see it, and Remake does it really well. The polygonal count throughout the game looks high, even for small non-interactive objects like office clutter, rubbish in bins, buttons and dials on electrical panels or ovens, various kitchenwares in the restaurants, and probably the best looking popcorn you'll see in a game outside of a cutscene. I have to assume UE5's nanite is being used here to achieve such macro detail, and another UE5 game I'm playing also shows similar details on small props. I think it's cool that games are starting to do this, but it does make me wonder if the time, effort and money is worth it in the end. The original surprised me as well in this regard because the objects actually look far more detailed than you'd expect, so perhaps then it's the tradition of having high polygonal counts for small objects that has been kept with the remake. While I don't have exact numbers, the character models also look to have a high polygonal count as well, and likely have numbers ranging in from around 80 to 120,000. For comparison, the average PS1 game character likely would have been around 500, the PS2 5,000, the PS3 20,000 and PS4 around 80,000. It's probable that the nose on James in Remake has more polygons on it than the entirety of his PS2 model, which is funny to think about. It's kind of crazy to think now that the entire character models of modern games literally have more polygons in them than levels of PS2 games, or at least large chunks of them. One particular element of the character model stuck out in Remake, and it's the eyes. You wouldn't really think eyes are hard to make in a video game, but getting the correct amount of reflection from light sources, the specular highlights because of the eye's moisture, and the correct amount of depth is not easy. All you have to do is go back one generation where this stuff only really started becoming decent looking with the PS4. Because of Remake's new cutscene direction, where James sometimes speaks less than he would in the original, the game makes up for it more with its modern facial animation, and so the eyes in the remake have become much more prominent in these cutscenes throughout, in helping us to understand how a character might be feeling or expressing. The animations on characters' faces is done well throughout Remake. There's small little subtle movements when their expression changes, and James in particular is well animated throughout the game. Sometimes he doesn't have to say anything, but we kind of understand how he's feeling just based on his face. There isn't any real comparison here though with the original. The older game looks stiff in comparison and has this weird animation when James is running. His arm looks kind of detached from the rest of the body, which looks awful. I believe the CRT has masked this because I've only noticed it now on a higher resolution. But the overall animation and cutscenes is just really not good compared to Remake at all, which is I suppose expected for a 2001 game when you compare it with a 2024 game, but still. With that being said though, the original game holds up really well, and back in 2001 it was incredible looking, I vividly remember being blown away by the visuals having come from the PS1 and N64, and as silly as it sounds, the game might as well have been photorealistic to me back then too. For as good as the remake's graphics are, it's come at a cost, which is the frame rate. The game has two graphics options, performance and quality. Performance mode runs the game at a lower resolution and graphical fidelity, but runs it at 60 FPS. I found it to be a solid 60 FPS maybe 85% of the time, which for me wasn't good enough, as the frame rate drops were often enough to be distracting. I played through the game in quality mode, which renders at a higher resolution and detail, but runs at 30 FPS, which isn't ideal, but still playable. The issue here is, even in the quality mode, the game still dropped frames quite often, which is unusual for most games in their quality setting. You can see it happen in the melee fights with enemies or moving the camera around while exploring, and there is also stuttering that persists throughout the game, usually when loading new areas and such. It's not an unplayable experience or anything, but it is disappointing that it couldn't lock to 30 at the very least. The resolution seems to be around 1440p in quality and possibly 1200p or so in performance. Resolution wise, they're actually somewhat close and overall graphically look similar enough, with the exception of the ray tracing, which looks far worse in performance mode. To be expected though. One other strange omission is a photo mode. Many games nowadays come with one, and considering all the small little details that Remake has and the setting's atmosphere, a photo mode would have went hand in hand with a game like this. I don't know if Blooper Team their previous games had one, but if this is the case with them not wanting to ruin the pacing and serious tone of the game, with players constantly stopping to take photos or whatever, then all respect to them for not including one, and I kind of agree. It won't be a Silent Hill 2 review without talking about the amazing soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka. The music of the game is really unique, and I don't think I've heard anything like it in any other medium. I describe it as a dark ambient soundtrack mixed with industrial noise, along with some traditional songs in there as well. The entire soundtrack contributes to the unsettling nature of the town itself and what's happening with James as he progresses through the story. It goes from melancholic sounding with some mystique at the start to being more unhinged and aggressive towards the end. There's regular softer tracks for when he's meeting characters too. It has a great synergy to the cutscenes and gameplay throughout. The same composer returns for Remake, and many of the original game's tracks return as well, but with some alterations, whether it's new instruments, a slower tempo, and sometimes more aggression to account for the new direction of the cutscenes themselves. The new songs are still recognisably based on the originals, so it's not like they've gutted them entirely. I really like some of the new takes on the old songs, Heaven's Night being my favourite. It makes it feel livelier, which is really actually unsettling considering it's an empty nightclub. The Day of Night now has a female chorus which helps push the feeling of loss. Anam Cara I've already spoken about, and while it moved locations in the remake, the song itself turned an empty apartment room into one of the more emotional parts of the game, and all within gameplay. I should mention while we're here, there are 3 musical sheets new to Remake that you can find throughout the game. It seems Mary enjoyed playing them on the piano, and so these songs must have been her favourites to play. Of course, they also might carry some meaning. The first one is Robert Schumann's 1849 classical piece, Einsam Blumen, which translates to Lonely Flowers. I likely butchered that pronunciation as well as the others, but I couldn't find any more information on the meaning behind the song itself. But the title could be a reference to James and Mary being on their own. He's alone in Silent Hill, and she's likely somewhere wandering the afterlife without James. The second is Russian composer Alexander Scriabin's Vers la Flamme, which translates to Towards the Flame. The meaning behind the song is that the composer believed a constant accumulation of heat would eventually destroy the world. This was probably chosen for a few reasons. It could be a reference to Angela's Otherworld, the burning of the hotel, or the feelings James would have had being alone in a town that is now abandoned and full of monsters and other paranormal behaviours. He probably thinks the world has ended or is ending. The third is Intermezzo No. 2 by Johannes Brahms. The music itself doesn't seem to have a meaning, but the story behind it does. He wrote it for a woman he wanted to have a relationship with, but never could. This is likely a reference to James wanting to be with Mary, but no longer can because of her death. All three musical sheets were likely played by Mary too, and seem to be a progression of her illness. The first one is her being alone in the hospital, the second is the disease progressively killing her, and then the third is her death itself. It's just speculation on my part, of course, and I might be reaching. There's a curious change in the remake for two of the ending songs which have been swapped out with each other. The In Water ending in the original used to play the song Angels Thanatos, which is a grungy industrial song, and was likely chosen to be a juxtaposition of the atmosphere of the game and ending. I may get flack for this, but I think it's an awful song for such an ending. I understand why they chose it, but it just doesn't work for me at all, and it seems like the developers agree too, because they decided to use the reprise version of Promise for the same ending in Remake, and it completely suits it perfectly. The Angel Thanatos song has been moved over now to Maria's ending, which to me makes more sense, because it feels like a proper bad ending. James made a choice you wouldn't expect him to make in this ending, and so the song more accurately reflects this with its more aggressive tone. I think Blooper made the correct choices here. There was maybe two songs I had an issue with in terms of their composition in the remake. One of them is Unhinged Betrayal. The song itself makes sense for the fight thematically, but I felt compared to the original, it's way too bombastic. The second one, Team of Laura, doesn't sound right to me either. It feels like a worse cover of the original song. That said, it was only two songs I took issue with. The rest of the soundtrack is outstanding, and some songs for me might have been superior to the originals, like the mentioned Day of Night track. I also want to mention that the ambient music is fantastic too. It's usually subtle, but it's a big reason the game's atmosphere works so well in general. A favourite example of mine is the track Blood Pulse. It returns from the original game and plays in the apartments. It helps that many of these songs synergise as well with the environment they play in. I'm glad then that they got the original composer back to do the score, and I think it was the right choice, because the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2 is both unique and important. that anyone else trying to replicate it might have failed, and that would have been enough to ruin the game for many people. Before we get to the conclusion of this video and the ending of the game, I think it's time to talk about a theory that's been around for both remake and original. It's the time loop theory. Basically, players have noticed particular messages in the games that suggest James is stuck in some sort of purgatory and is repeating the events of the story over and over again. The original game didn't have too much evidence of this, but remake is a different matter altogether. If the theory is in any way true, which we don't know, then Silent Hill 2 Remake could be considered, and I know this sounds stupid, a sequel to the original PS2 game. Before we look at the evidence, I want to mention that I'm in no way endorsing this theory. I know part of the Silent Hill community really hates it because it stops the story from having a definitive ending. I totally understand that, and I agree myself, but Remake does seem to lean in the direction of confirming this theory, and I just want to point out some of the things that have been noticed, because they are at the very least interesting, whether you're for or against the theory itself. So in Remake, as you make your way into the town, you're introduced to a new gameplay element where if you go close to certain parts of the map and inspect them, a sound and short cutscene will play out. I'm not sure what you'd call these things, but we'll call them flashback moments to keep it simple, and you'll see many more of them throughout the game. They are basically callbacks to the original game, whether it's locations that have been cut from the remake, items and puzzles that have been moved around, where you can expect the remnants of them in their original location. By the time I saw the 5th flashback, I got suspicious, however. I thought it was interesting that the developer went to the trouble of actually modelling these things out, along with their unique camera angles, sound effects and visual noise when you find one. Once I found the 7th one, I knew something was up. Developers just don't go to this kind of effort to tickle our nostalgia. Once was almost enough, maybe 2 or 3 times, but the entire game has them dotted around the place, right up until the end. Consider new players as well, they might be wondering what is happening and why without any explanation whatsoever. We know we're playing a remake of a PS2 game, we don't need to be reminded of this every area we enter, and if this is simply for nostalgic reasons, I honestly have to say I'm kind of disappointed. Not because it disproves the theory, but in any other game it would come off as cheesy and we'd be criticising the developers for it. Considering how good this remake turned out and the effort gone into respecting the original game, I don't believe these flashback moments are for nostalgia at all. So that's number 1. Number 2. Another new thing the developers added to the game is collectible photographs. You'll find these usually hidden away in a room and there's 26 of them to collect. They have observations or ominous writing on them, and flipping them over reveals a number unique to each one. Presumably these photos were taken by Mary when they were visiting Silent Hill on vacation, although they're very abstract at times in terms of what the picture even is. In the photos themselves, they don't really have meanings behind them either, so if they're just mostly random photos, then what is the point of them? The written words in the front are actually deliberate, and if you count how many objects or things are in the actual photos themselves, and then match that number up with the letter in the writing, there's a hidden message pieced together when you collect all 26, and it spells out, "You've been here for 2 decades," which obviously insinuates that James has been stuck in purgatory for 20 years at least. I didn't discover this, and credit goes to Reddit user Dale Robinson for finding it out. A developer of the game even confirmed it as well, so you can argue it's a small Easter egg poking fun at the players who have been stuck playing the original game for such an amount of time without a remake, but it doesn't add up. Consider once again the developers went through the trouble of making the assets and applying the effects over them to look like an old photo, and then having 26 of them in the game along with doing the programming. There are many ways of poking fun at the player, but this seems to be a bit over the top if you ask me. Usually a small Easter egg or 2 suffices, and so I'm counting this as number 2. Number 3. This one also goes back to the original game. There are a few dead bodies around the town which have some interesting messages attached to them, as well as their appearance. They kinda look like James, and I'll be damned if they aren't the exact same model being reused. For situations like this, I wish I had the PC version so I can actually examine it better and confirm if it is the same model. Even still, they look extremely similar to James if you look at the boots, the middle stitching on his coat, and their hair. In the original, it was assumed perhaps that they were reusing assets to speed up development time, but now that Remake has done the same thing, it's hard to agree on that logic. One particular dead body is in the Woodside apartments looking at a TV that's turned on, and its head is covered up, It is confirmed in the original that it's the same model as James, and in the videotape scene it has a similar pose to James when he's done watching the tape. In the remake it's more covered up, but you can tell it's James because of the exact same shoes and trousers. So what's going on then? Well, the theory for these dead bodies is that they were previous attempts by James to push through the town and was killed by the monsters and such. In the case of the apartment body, it was likely suicide with a gun, considering the TV is on. He may have perhaps manifested the murder of his wife onto the TV and decided to end his life there and then. Some of the bodies have notes too, usually warning anyone reading them to run away, or tips on how to kill the monsters. An interesting one I found is on the road past the Historical Society. It reads, "I can leave by not leaving, I can only leave by not leaving," which kind of tells me that James is simply going through the motions of this journey and it's not letting him escape, but instead to accept his situation. One body even has a worn out portion of the map from the original game. You can argue these are manifestations, but then what's the purpose of them? I've seen people suggest it's James' want and need for punishment, but Pyramid Head already does that. So perhaps it's his need to die then. It's hard to say, but the fact that the dead bodies look like him and reference the original does make me believe that they're part of this time loop theory overall, so I'm counting it as number 3. There's a few smaller hidden messages, like in the Woodside apartment, there's a note in room 208, which suggests an unnamed person is making the same mistakes repeatedly, and that the person is stuck in some sort of prison of their own making. Or how about the hospital TV broadcasting Morse code that says again and again, repeatedly? There's also a dead lion figure body we see in an area based on the boss fight with Pyramid Head in the original. It sort of insinuates that the fight has already happened, although I could be reaching there. There's likely more hidden references I missed, but those 3 points are the ones pushing this theory for people. Even though I'm overall opposed to the theory being true, I can't look past all of these additions made to the remake and simply think they're making fun of the player's nostalgia. If it's true then, let's be honest, if this was any other game or franchise, we'd be calling these inclusions lame. Because nostalgia is an easy way to affect someone's emotion, and most of the time it's done as a cheap thrill, rather than having any thought behind it, where it would have far more emotional impact. So when you see the amount of effort gone into this game overall from Blooper, and the careful considerations with the story itself, I can't see these additions to the game as just cheap thrills. This doesn't mean that the theory has to be true either, and I think it's very unlikely the developers will ever confirm it. It does at least create an interesting discussion about the ramifications, as well as a potentially interesting twist on the formula of remakes in general. Either way, everyone playing the game can just decide whether or not they want the theory to be true, since we'll likely never know. With all of that said, for me, this story does have a definitive conclusion, and I think it's time to finally see it. The only thing left now to do is to look at the ending of the game before I give my final overall thoughts. I got the in-water ending, which seems to be the closest one to canon based on developer opinion, and when looking at the other endings I have to agree because its emotional impact and scene setup simply makes the most sense to me. So I apologise to anyone who has gotten a different ending to myself, but even if I did achieve all of them, I'd still pick and talk about the in-water ending anyway, so hopefully you understand where I'm coming from. So the journey's now over and it's time to watch the ending play out.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday.
Having dealt with the pain of losing his wife and finding out that she was never in Silent Hill, James decides he can no longer continue on and commits suicide. Mary begins reading the letter we have at the start of the game, and yet another amazing twist, it turns out the letter we had at the very start was only a partial copy and was likely conjured up by the town itself in order to attract James to it in the first place. As Mary reads the missing parts of the letter, we find out that she's sorry for treating James badly and hopes he can forgive her for what he's been put through. In the end, she always loved James and wanted him to live his life to the fullest after she was gone. Of course, the sad part is, had James read the full letter, this entire ordeal could have been avoided altogether. And as the letter slowly descends to the depths of the lake in a brilliant visual added by the remake, you can't help but feel sad about the entire story and what it's led to. Silent Hill 2's in-water ending is brutal. There's no happily ever after like in the fairy tales. Everyone's either dead or alone. The cruelty, malice and the entity of the town has consumed these people and has won the battle. James, after his suicide, will likely not be going to the same place as Mary, just as the message in Neely's bar said. The entire story is depressing, but that's what's also great about it. A lot of stories have happy endings because we connect with these characters and learn about their lives and history. We want a happy ending for them because most of the time they're good people who deserve it. But James is not a good person. Whatever his reason for killing, there's no justification for it. She was going to die eventually, and yet he still decided the best thing to do was to end her life early, because she abused him here and there. Yes, the abuse was uncalled for, but from her perspective, she must have been in a ton of pain, and we now know she regretted it. He killed her because she was an inconvenience to his life, and an obstacle to other women too, if we go by Maria's manifestation. He may have loved her, but he also resented her. And that's the story of Silent Hill 2. The original game's tackling of serious subjects like suicide was groundbreaking for its time. I know it wasn't the first game to explicitly talk or even depict suicide and depression in this medium. Final Fantasy VI comes to mind. But considering the serious psychological atmosphere, it probably shocked a good amount of people who played it in 2001. There were games with deep storylines exploring various themes, usually on PC, but when it came to the console market, they were rare in comparison. Konami and Team Silent set a new benchmark with Silent Hill 2 all the way back in 2001, and within a new mainstream console's launch window no less, where the risk would have been greater of having to be told to tone it down or censor it by the ratings board or maybe even Sony themselves. I honestly found the remake to even be more depressing than the original, and that's what surprised me about this remake altogether. It respected the original game's tone, atmosphere and story, but wasn't afraid to perhaps push the bar a little bit higher. Not to the point where it would have deviated from the original too much like most remakes, but enough to make it familiar but also different. It's a rarity in any industry for a remake to even be half as good as the original, but this remake is something of an unexpected coup. As of writing this review, Blooper Team and Konami have announced a continuation of their partnership. It's very likely that Silent Hill 1 and 3 will be the next remakes, and I'm honestly looking forward to them now that I know this developer can do the job. I never played those games before either, so they'll be brand new to me as well. As of recording this review, Silent Hill F has been released and seems to be a good game that has also sold well too. There is also now a confirmation of a Silent Hill 1 remake. I look forward to playing these games in the future. When the Resident Evil franchise went through its own successful rebirth, I would have never expected the Silent Hill franchise to also do the same. Consider that Konami was out of gaming for a while, along with the previous Silent Hill games selling poorly, along with the poor critical receptions of those later games as well. The chance of this remake being made, let alone successful, was slim to none. And yet here we are. Blooper Team, a company that has made games that were maybe AA at best with some neat ideas here and there, but an otherwise unknown developer, has actually done what I thought even the most world-class AAA developer would have likely failed at. They've given us a modernised Silent Hill 2 that is not only on par with the original, but actually surpasses it in many ways. It's not perfect, it has flaws like any other game, but they weren't bad enough to stop me enjoying the experience. I must mention also that I was once again surprised at how well the original holds up. I recommend you give it a go if you can get your hands on a copy, and hopefully in the future Konami can do it proper justice with a new remaster, as it's my belief that older games should always be available, one way or another. In conclusion, the best thing I can say about Silent Hill 2 Remake is that it stands side by side with the original game. Thanks for watching.